What's up?
Hello, Joe.
Groundhog Day. As you can see, it's still freezing in these parts by my attire. It's actually pretty warm over where you are, obviously. It's warmer where you are.
It's warmer. I'm not
I should be on that side of the table.
No.
It's obviously warm over there.
6 more weeks of winter,
Yeah.
according to Groundhog Phil.
Groundhog Phil?
Yeah.
It's Groundhog Day.
It was last week,
Yeah.
February 2nd.
And?
He comes out, he sees his shadow. It's 6 more weeks of winter. If he doesn't see his shadow,
Yeah.
spring is around the corner.
Yeah.
This was on my mind. I was watching the reporting around this incident in Syria. What was it, Wednesday, Thursday? It was a weird week, you know. It had a lot of like news items that no one thing dominated. One thing was pushed off the page the next day. And for one whole day, there was this incident in Syria where the U.S. conducted a military operation right up there in Idlib on Turkey's border. Do you think that was the first kind of U.S. operation? I mean, other than the fact that they're practically occupying the other corner of Syria since 2 or 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first we've heard of any U.S. operations.
Well, that they tell you about, right?
Right, that you hear about. That's not the only thing we want to talk about. We want to talk about, of course, the situation in Ukraine, of course. That's why it's kind of like Groundhog Day, because it's the same old, right? And the week kind of encapsulated. Every day in the week had the big story was either Syria, Ukraine, both of which, of course, concerned major geopolitical standoff between the US and Russia. Then there's mass protests. They keep going on. You know, the protest movement in Canada is still new, but it's going into its, third week at this point. But it's kind of like Groundhog Day elsewhere. There's still mass protests all across Europe. The French just had the 30th weekend in a row of major protests. The media here, you know, covers it a little, but it doesn't really get out into the English-speaking world. Major protests in Australia, of course, after probably inspired in large part by what happened in Canada. So that's kind of like Groundhog Day was what it occurs to me. It's like we're going round and round, you know, it's the same things.
Yeah.
And nothing changes, so to speak. But we would say that it does all speak to big change, you know. It's not going to happen overnight, but this is as much as it's a drag on people to hear nonstop pandemic news, nonstop, you can't do this, you can't do that, you must do that, nonstop wars and rumors of wars, right? It's an incredible time of change at the same time.
Right.
Of course, we also want to talk about but one day it was headline news in the US after this crazy statement from the Pentagon about their bombshell revelation that Russia's planning false flag attack in Ukraine.
Yeah.
What do you want to start with?
We'll throw up that, since you started with it, throw up that picture I just sent you there, Scotty. That link I just sent you. It's just around the... this is the scene of the supposed attack, alleged attack, whatever, by US forces in Syria, in Idlib province. This is... in theory, supposedly, the description on the video there is people inspect a destroyed house following an operation by US military in the Syrian village of Atme in Idlib province. US Special Forces conducted a large-scale counter-terrorism raid in northwestern Syria overnight. A bit far from home, but whatever. That's the global war on terror for you. And what the Pentagon said was a successful mission. Residents and activists reported multiple deaths, including civilians, i.e. civilians being women and children, mostly. The official story was that it was an ISIS leader who blew himself up. Now, that video would suggest the guy's name is Al-Qurashi. that video would suggest, of course, the questions that were raised. Do you have the video of Matt Lee or the State Department stuff you were talking about?
Yes.
Well, actually, that's a separate topic.
It's
a separate
they're
topic.
linked,
Anyway,
but it's separate.
So anyway, this was this is the scene, and obviously, so just like I just said, it was the leader, the successor to al-Baghdadi. If you remember al-Baghdadi, the mysterious, elusive al-Baghdadi was killed a few years ago, supposedly, again by U.S. forces, and now this is his successor who has been killed. Of course, ISIS has been doing pretty much nothing, really, since the Russian military took care of ISIS, the problem of ISIS in Syria and to a certain extent Iraq, but primarily Syria. Really, about 3 years ago now? It was kind of like more or less done and dusted, 2018. And that was after years of... there's a beepy going on. That was after years of the US apparently doing nothing. If people want a little quick recap, if you remember from history, recent history that you may have forgotten, ISIS spread across out of Iraq and into Syria starting about 2014, and was made massive gains across, took over more or less Iraq, most of Iraq, or major parts of Iraq, apart from the north and the Kurds and stuff, but then swept into Syria. Coincidentally, at a time, a few years into the supposed Syrian civil war, when there was a popular uprising in 2011, starting in 2011, to overthrow Assad. But anybody who's familiar with the topic knows that this was basically a Western, more or less, inspired proxy war against the Syrian government to try and overthrow Assad, because Assad wasn't the kind of leader that the Americans wanted or the Saudis wanted, because he was, aligned with Iran and, to do with basically the geopolitics of that region. It's too much to go into right now, but suffice to say that Syria in 2011 began to be flooded with jihadi proxy forces in the pay of America and its allies and Saudi Arabia primarily, to overthrow, to attempt to destroy the country, destroy the Syrian Arab army under Assad and get rid of Assad. It didn't work out. It was getting close to that point in about 2016, 17. Was it 17 that Russia went in?
They went in 15.
Oh, sorry, 2015. So 2015, it was a year. They were getting to the point where ISIS were, pretty much had almost taken over the country, and Russia went in. It was September, the first attack by Russia on ISIS, and they pretty much cleaned it up within about a year. You could say 6 months maybe, but let's say a year, 18 months. It was pretty much done, and this was after about 18 months or almost 2 years of the US apparently having no effect whatsoever on ISIS and the associated jihadi forces that were meant to overthrow and destroy Syria and overthrow Assad. US couldn't do anything with it despite its massive military might. Russia comes in, and like I said, within 6 months they'd put a serious dent in ISIS and pushed them back, and they were gone within about a year and a half. So yes, since then, so that would take us to, from say 2015. By 2017 for sure, ISIS was done in Syria. America's imperial agenda in the country had been pretty much cancelled by the Russian military, and you heard nothing from ISIS since then, really, until supposedly now just pops up out of nowhere after 2 years of COVID and pandemic and the ISIS leader, who apparently has been doing nothing.
I love how the first thing you hear about there being a new ISIS leader is that we got him.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, if you're interested, he has a page on Wikipedia and that kind of stuff, and
maybe
history.
Maybe he was,
but not in the media. But so he warranted, being killed. And I suppose the point of that picture I just put up there is that, just getting to the point here, he was if you put the picture back up there, Scotty, the point, the question was whether or not the US had actually, whether or not if the official story was true, which was that according to the official story, they decided the US was trying to be very careful and not cause any civilian casualties, and so they went in on foot. Basically, they didn't use any missile strikes. But unfortunately, this ISIS al-Qurashi guy, leader, blew himself up. There was a question over whether or not that was the case. Because, if people remember again, it's not too long ago, back in last summer, when the US was affecting its disastrous pullout from Afghanistan, the US fired a missile at a house, basically in
Kabul.
In Afghanistan, saying that there was an imminent car bomb attack coming from that location. But apparently there wasn't. It was just somebody's house, and they killed an entire family. I think it was 7 people in total killed. So initially they said it was a car bomb, then they had to admit that actually there was no car bomb there, but they just killed a family in Afghanistan. So given that, when they come out with this statement that they had killed the ISIS leader and unfortunately had killed 3 or 4 children and 3 or 4 women as well, the media was, it was a warranted question about whether or not that was actually true. Or if in a few days or a week or something or 2 weeks we're going to find out that this wasn't actually the ISIS leader, it wasn't any real target, and we just killed another family.
Yeah.
But in response to that, Jen Psaki, in response to those questions from some journalists, Jen Psaki said, "Well, do you believe us, or do you believe ISIS?" So it's either like you're either with us or against us. You're not allowed to question these things. What we say is it's sacrosanct. It's the absolute truth. You're not allowed to question it, even though we're on record of having lied before, or at least got things wrong before. But anyway, the official story was that he blew himself up. He went suicide bomby, and the reason I put up that picture is because the evidence in that picture suggests to me that part of the story is probably true, because if there was actually a missile strike on that building, you would probably have a lot more damage. It looks like, I don't know, it looks kind of to me like it's a veranda that has collapsed. A few pillars maybe came down or something like that, but you would expect that if there was a powerful enough or fairly powerful missile strike from a plane on that building, most of the building will be gone, or there would be a bigger hole in it than there is there. The very fact that those people in the picture can stand on the roof suggests to me that there was some kind of smaller explosion, although I can't be sure about that.
Yeah. There are pictures as well that show a big scorch mark in a field next to the house, though.
Right.
And some of the descriptions have, like, the gunfire took place over 3 hours. Surely if you're approaching the building and then boom, your target goes suicidal, that's the end of the story. What's with the 3-hour gunfight? I mean, this is mainstream descriptions. Damage to neighboring buildings. Well, it wasn't exactly a tenement slum. You can see that they're basically half-built villas in the area,
Right.
Each one on a 1-acre plot or something.
Yep.
So, a 3-hour exchange of gunfight? Anyway, it was so strange. Like, the description of it, breaking news. We went in, he blew himself up, that was the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
It actually got American reporters asking questions, which they rarely do.
Mm-hmm. And it got some people, it got some rare pushback from CNN, of all places. Jake Tapper, I think, was quite annoyed and disgusted at that response from Jen Psaki. You either believe us or you believe ISIS, and he himself cited or one of his guests, whatever, cited the fact that they had lied before, so they have every right to question and stuff like that. So it's strange, let's say, to me anyway, to hear that kind of a pushback from the very very pro government, let's say, or media, or pro Biden government anyway, who traditionally don't question those kind of things, and just they hold the U.S. intelligence community and services and their intelligence in high regard, and generally don't question it, except for maybe long after the fact, when they can't deny the fact that it was bogus, like, for example, Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, or several other bogus statements by the U.S. intelligence community.
Yeah.
So yeah,
And then maybe as a result of that, it got pushed off the front pages. It lasted 24 hours. I mean, can you see any genuine strategic value for why the US did this from the point of view of what's going on in Syria?
Well, that region, that Idlib region, is a kind of protectorate for and has been for most of the whole so-called supposed, well, they call it civil war. It's not a civil war. The war against Syria over the past, really, it's almost like 10 years now, really, since it began. That area of Idlib has been has held out, as the jihadi forces sponsored by the US and by Saudi were pushed westwards, out of, because they couldn't go back to Iraq, so they had to go, basically were pushed westwards, and they hold up basically in Idlib, which is in this area, which is close to, it's just north of Latakia, where there's a Russian base, and it's quite close to, well, maybe we'll throw up do we have a map here? Yeah, throw up this map just so you can see, give you an idea of what we're talking about. It's only a little, it's only a small map, but it just gives you an idea there at the top. So that's that Hatay province is and if you see it in the smaller key there down at the bottom, that's a little wiener of Turkey that comes down into Syria, and it's been has for a long time been contested for really since 1922, since the French mandate in Syria went basically, or a French mandate in the Middle East, where the French basically ceded that part of which was Syria to Turkey, and it's been a contested region. Syria still claims it as their own, and there's a lot of Turkmens in there. Basically, it's a whole, it's a long running kind of conflict. It's been fairly peaceful for most of that time, but it's a bone of contention between Syria and Turkey, and Turkey has been along its border there. If you just to the right of in that image of to the right of Hatay province, you have the border with Turkey, and Turkey, if you remember again over the Syrian conflict, Turkey was very concerned about any incursions or maintaining its control over. It actually took quite a chunk of land south of the Turkish border into Syria there throughout the whole war or attack on Syria. So Turkey's been very concerned about and has concerned about ceding any territory, let's say, in that whole conflict, when there's all sorts of different groups fighting against each other, supported by the US, supported by Turkey, supported by Syria, supported by the Saudis, different factions. Turkey was front and center in all of that in terms of protecting its own kind of territorial integrity, and obviously this little province, which it saw as potentially losing in that whole fog of war situation, So Turkey has definitely, the Turks under Erdogan are, they're fairly strict Muslim type, at least Erdogan is, and he sees Islam as a kind of state religion, and as and ideologically, lots of people claim
his problem is Kurds.
Right, exactly.
He has this 20-kilometer band,
right,
incursion into northern Syria all the way across.
Yeah.
That's occupied by the Turkish army for almost 3 years at this point.
Yeah.
And it's because he's between the lines. What it is he's afraid that the US and London and Paris, etc., and Israel are going to go Plan B. The Russians, having basically cleansed Syria of ISIS, Plan B was create some kind of Kurdish autonomous region in the northeast chunk,
or use certain jihadis to infiltrate into Turkey,
right.
And you know what I mean. There was lots of potential threats to Turkey in that respect, And of course, Turkey then was part of the whole conflict. It had its own kind of mercenary types that were involved in the conflict as well. So it's a pretty complicated situation. But if you just, it's a like I said, it's a complicated situation. It's kind of in the past now to a large extent, except for this odd kind of like killing of an ISIS commander or something like that by the US to keep their hand in and to, I suppose, focus public's attention on the idea of geopolitics and fighting the war on terror, and America's still relevant overseas and all that kind of stuff plays into it. But there's a good, if you want to sum it up, if you just throw up the Los Angeles Times Times article. This is from 2016, so right kind of in the middle of it. The title really is of the article is enough to explain to you, although it obviously opens a whole can of worms, but you can get the general idea from this title. It's from the Los Angeles Times. Like I said, in Syria, militias armed by the Pentagon fight those armed by the CIA.
When's that from?
2016.
16. Nuts. Oh, that's true.
March 2016. And of course, you've got that area basically pretty much where that recent, where the ISIS commander, supposed leader of ISIS, although he wasn't really, ISIS doesn't exist to any great extent. It never really existed except when it was supported by the US and Syria, and it was made up of all sorts of different factions of different people, all doing it for different reasons, but the common denominator among them all was money. They were all being paid. Timber Sycamore, Operation Timber Sycamore. Look up Operation Timber Sycamore on, that was the CIA under Obama financing jihadi
Moderates,
extremists.
quote.
No, moderates, whatever. Anyway, that area, those three little bomb areas, that's the general area. Idlib's just slightly to the left there where this guy was killed. So that's been a kind of a, in the latter years of this conflict, has been the last holdout or the remaining hotspot, if you know what I mean, of activity, such as to whatever extent there is any activity, which there isn't really a lot.
Yeah.
But it's been pretty bad. I mean, let's just go to on that topic. Let's just go to the YouTube video, Scotty, and give you another. I'm giving broad overviews here because it's way too complicated to get into in any specific detail, and all that information is available. But let's just play a few minutes of this, or not even a few minutes. About a minute.
In the past decade, 3 countries in the Middle East have undergone devastating civil wars that have claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people: Yemen, Iraq, and Syria. And in the time between 2012 and 2016, when the 2 black marble photos were compiled, much has changed. In Yemen, the lights have gone out across conflict zones since the civil war began in 2014, and after nearly 400,000 deaths. In Iraq, ISIS has been long since defeated, but from 2012 to 2016, you can clearly see the lights fading to darkness in all of the areas that they captured and occupied. And then, worst of all, there are the effects of war that can be clearly seen from space above Syria. As the civil war in the country intensified and the catastrophic destruction began growing greater, as much as 80% of the lights in the country went out in just the 4 years between 2012 and 2016. The most significant changes of all came around the city of Aleppo, the largest city inside of Syria and one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. As the 4 years between 2012 and 2016 went by, the lights across the city went out. And that tells us a very, very grim story. For in those 4 years, one of the most
that's thanks America. You can thank America for that, because all of that was instigated and facilitated and happened because of America.
Because the CIA and the Pentagon had a little war amongst themselves, apparently.
Well,
Functionally, effectively, that's what it was.
They, in the same way, they teamed up with the Saudis in the late 70s and 80s in Afghanistan and flooded the country with jihadis, whipped up a bunch of jihadis and armed them and trained them and funded them. They did exactly the same thing in Syria starting in 2011, but really got going in 2000, a couple of years later. And that was the result up to 2016. You had, when you see the lights going out across a country like that, well, you can imagine the devastation that was caused, you know.
Yeah.
And it was all to get rid of, it was all for geopolitics, basically, for control of the region. The Saudis were very, very happy to be part of it because Syria was, you know, Assad was Alawite, which is, you know, Shiite aligned with Iran, and the conflict in Yemen is the same. The Houthis are Shiites who are aligned with Iran, so it's all to protect America's petro state, Saudi Arabia, and the petrodollar, and America hegemony, and all that kind of stuff. It's a complicated topic. We've written about it, talked about it before. Other people have talked about it and written about it a lot. It's very clear. It's very obvious when you furnish yourself with the facts of the case, and the only thing that would stop you accepting it for what it actually is some kind of ideology that America goes around the world spreading freedom and democracy rather than turning out lights. That's what it does.
Yeah.
So,
for what it's worth, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights reports there were Russian airstrikes in Idlib later that day.
Hmm.
Connected? Don't know.
Well, again, it's like,
What was the official U.S. reason for it? It was just to take...
yeah.
Biden could just say,
The war against
we killed
ISIS.
the leader of ISIS.
Yeah, Biden could get on there and look presidential and look like he's actually worth anything and can do anything and has any oversight over anything. It's a bit of a big up to Biden. He's had a pretty bad year, you know.
And he gets his photo up in the Situation Room.
Right, but it's also, like I said, just, not far, just not relatively close to that area of Idlib. You have the Russian... two Russian military bases, basically a naval base and a military base, and the Russians obviously are concerned about the US attempting to, in the broader geopolitical war that's been going on for 80 years now maybe, against Russia. They're concerned about, American deviousness, using proxy forces and starting wars and with an attempt to push Russia out of wherever they can push Russia out of, basically. So Russia's still active, still keeping an eye on the situation, because it can flare up at any time. If they were able to flood the country with, by some estimates, 250,000 jihadis, armed jihadis across Syria, Iraq, and then Syria, they can certainly muster, can certainly do that again. Maybe not to the same extent, but they can start something else again. So it's like when you're dealing with America and you're Russia, or any of America's adversaries, so-called adversaries in America's eyes, you have to be you have to pay attention all the time. You have to be very alert to any potential attack, because that's what they're dedicating themselves to 24/7, is to cause problems for their geopolitical adversaries.
I wonder, though, if there must have been some back-channel talk before this, because the official reports say that the U.S. raid took place with troops who flew in helicopters from northeastern Syria, which would have taken them across airspace patrolled, maybe in part by Turkey further north, but over Syria proper, it's Russian airspace, Russian Syrian co-controlled airspace.
Yeah.
So I wonder if they...
Well, they allow...
how do they do that, without... And then they had to get in and then get out.
Well, the Russians know for sure that that's what was going on. There was communications between the two. Officially stated that there were communications between the two.
It was stated, okay.
But the Americans told the Russians that they were going to be doing something and to stay out of the way type thing, Yeah. So it's not, Russia doesn't have a veto or monopoly or complete control over that area of Syria. They have they maintain their own spheres of influence to the extent that they can. And they just watch each other with suspicion. But you're talking about Groundhog Day. There should be a groundhog that comes out and tells us whether or not there's going to be another 6 weeks of reports about Russia is going to invade Ukraine, or whether it's going to end. If he sees a shadow, it's another 6 weeks of bullshit media headlines saying Russia poised to invade Ukraine, X thousand more troops on Ukraine's border. Or if he doesn't see a shadow, then I don't know, we're going to get an economic collapse or something like that. I don't know. Somebody should get a new groundhog. A geopolitical groundhog, basically, is what we need. Bloomberg, interestingly, just they explained it afterwards, but it's interesting how the whole thing works. If you just throw up the Bloomberg JPEG, it's just a screenshot from Bloomberg. It was up for half an hour, I think. Bloomberg had decided that, if you see the top left there, the red box, Bloomberg had decided that had already happened this week for a while, for about half an hour. Russia had invaded Ukraine, according to Bloomberg, and then they, a few days later, put down a publishing error statement saying that they prepare headlines for many scenarios, and the headline "Russia invades Ukraine" was inadvertently published. We deeply regret the error, but it definitely got us a few more clicks, and that equates to dollars, so it's not all bad.
Yeah. In these people's minds, it's already happened anyway.
Yeah.
Crimea, Donbass, Russia's already invaded.
Yeah. again, they just this. I think US.com. I don't know what website US.com is there, Scotty, but I think this report, at least I saw it originally in the Financial Times, but the Financial Times is behind a paywall, so this is basically the same report, and this is like the next level. This is amping it up a little bit to nuclear war, because that's obviously the kind of behind the scenes, the threat behind the scenes is that you'd have a nuclear war between Russia and the US over Ukraine. And this report is just adding a bit more scaremongering. If you just scroll down a little bit, it says the US military and intelligence officials believe that Russia is planning to hold a big nuclear weapons exercise this month as a warning to NATO not to intervene if Putin decides to invade Ukraine. So this is General Mark Milley. You all know Mark Milley, the scary general guy, the stereotypical general, US general. And the Director of National Intelligence told lawmakers in Congress on Thursday past that Putin was planning to start the exercises in mid-February. And this is opposed to the annual nuclear exercises that Russia holds, which are usually in the fall, in the autumn. But the US believes Putin has decided to hold them earlier this year as a show of strength in the event that he orders his military to further invade Ukraine. Again, is that happening? We'll have to wait and see. I don't think there's been any official statement from the Russian government that they're bringing forward those nuclear exercises to February. But there is if you just see that small little paragraph there, the US believes that the optimum time for a Russian invasion would be from mid-February to the end of March. So the end of March would give us about 6 weeks or so. So it looks like we are going to have 6 more weeks of incessant bullshit in the headlines about Russia invading Ukraine until the end of March at least, because then by that's the cold months, you know, and the whole narrative is that if Russia's going to stage a mechanized military invasion, they need the ground to be frozen, and the ground will stay frozen in Ukraine, most of Ukraine, until the end of March. Come April, it starts to thaw. It's not good for rolling tanks over it, so you've got 6 weeks basically.
I have an interpretation of what this might be getting at, actually. Can you put that headline back so I can see the headline again? Yeah, it's oblique, but for what it's worth, John Helmer, who's an American writer, journalist in Moscow, he does very kind of incisive reporting on what exactly the Washington and Moscow say in their communications with each other, and kind of deciphers it quite well. Sometimes he's kind of like, you know, the language is so opaque, who knows what exactly they intend by these things. Anyway, he did an analysis of the US response to Putin's detailed sort of quasi-treaty that he wanted the US to respond to, which had 7 concise points. And John Helmer did a kind of a breakdown. The backstory to this is that the US did finally respond. We know that from last week, but we also know that they asked Moscow not to publish their response. So it would be, you know, behind closed doors. But then something weird happened in midweek. The US side leaked it to El País, the top newspaper in Spain of all places, who then published a story about it, along with a link to the PDF of this document. 3 days later, Washington confirmed, indeed, that is a genuine document. That's from us. For what it's worth, Helmer thinks the workaround was because if you look at the specific title of the document, it's called a non-paper. So this is our written response, but in future, Moscow can never cite this back to us because it's not a real written agreement. You see? But this is the whole thing with Putin. He's like, ever since 1990, when you promised us orally you would not move 1 inch closer NATO to Russia, we wanted things clearly laid out in treaties on paper. And this is the way the US is kind of handling that. It's to put it on paper, but not. Yeah, no, that was leaked. That wasn't us.
Yeah.
But in Helmer's analysis, he says that there's a specific point where he concludes the wording of the US response to point number 4, which is about the use of intermediate range nuclear forces. Helmer says this means that Washington is offering to trade the withdrawal of nuclear weapons in Ukraine for Russian withdrawal of nuclear weapons from Crimea and the Black Sea Fleet. I'm not sure. I can't explain exactly what, but I think that might be what they're making an oblique reference to. Nukes in Ukraine. They're kind of the twist in it is that it's the US which either has, and maybe this is why the heckles are up in Moscow these last 2 months, either has or is threatening to put nuclear capable missiles inside Ukraine. And the reason they were maybe in a rush to do so was that in the eventuality of this current situation of a bartering trade-off with Russia, the US could respond to Russia, okay, yeah, we'll withdraw our nukes from Ukraine if you withdraw yours from Crimea. But it's clever. It's clever, but it's not clever. Moscow saw that coming, miles off, which is why they're pushing for some kind of public international commitment here and now on Ukraine, NATO expansion, the use of missiles and where they're positioned, because they could see the sneaking, perhaps even of nuclear-tipped missiles into Ukraine for this eventuality to barter off with Russia.
Yeah. The whole, if I was to say, I mean, we mentioned it in previous shows about our analysis of the whole situation and why it happened. The US has been, like you mentioned, since the fall of the Soviet Union, the US has, under the guise of NATO, has been expanding towards Russia against what they said they would do since then, and has been, threatening Russia basically, unprovoked for no reason other than they wanted to. They wanted to contain Russia. They wanted to push back against Russia. They wanted to maintain their hegemony in the world, and they saw Russia, especially a Russia and China alliance, as being a threat to their freedom to operate as they wanted anywhere in the world against anyone. And it got to the point where, like we mentioned in previous shows, 2014, you had a coup in Ukraine, a US-backed coup in Ukraine that installed a kind of right-wing anti-Russia government and started building up the military. When just after that coup, just immediately after, around the time the coup happened, Russia took Crimea, which they saw clearly was one of the reasons why the coup was occurring, that they wanted to deprive Russia of access to the Black Sea with its Black Sea fleet in Sevastopol in Crimea. So they took Crimea and incorporated it into the Russian Federation, and they also moved to protect the people in eastern Ukraine and in the Donbass from these kind of right-wing neo-Nazi type elements within the new US-backed Ukrainian government that they literally hand-picked themselves. I mean, Victoria Nuland, I think she was the Undersecretary was she the Secretary of State at the time? I don't know if she was the Secretary, she was the Undersecretary of State at the time or something. She was in the State Department.
For Europe.
For European affairs,
yeah.
So she, and there's the audio of her basically saying, fuck the EU, we don't care what they think.
As Secretary of State for Europe.
Yeah, here's who's going to be in the new Ukrainian administration that we have just basically facilitated through a coup. So Russia saw that happening, took action against it. Of course, that spun as Russia annexing Crimea, Russia being... it's like the opposite of what's actually happening. Like, the US was encroaching directly onto the last sphere of influence, right up to the Russian border of Russia's sphere of influence, basically, and taking it and turning it against Russia. That was a definite red line for any country that has the ability to push back against it, and Russia decided to push back against it, and they did the only reasonable thing they could do, which was to protect their interests against this naked, unprovoked, unnecessary, unjustified aggression. But that spun as Russia was aggressing Ukraine. I mean, so everything is topsy-turvy, everything's turned upside down when you listen to the US government and the US media. Of course, if you just look at some of the facts or look at the details of the situation or furnish yourself with the details of the situation, you can see clearly that that's not what they say. What their narrative, the US narrative, is not what actually happened. It's more or less the opposite. As I've said many times on the show and elsewhere, these days, and for quite a long time, you can, on major issues, on some issues anyway, you can kind of flip the official US government narrative on its head, and you'll be much closer to the truth than the official narrative. But yeah, they've been doing it since then. There's a few interesting. If you just throw up NATO 1, this is actually as a JPEG or PNG. NATO 1 is an open letter to President Clinton against NATO expansion, from June 26, 1997. And it was signed by former Hawks, Robert McNamara, Paul Nietzsche, Stansfield Turner, Richard Pipes, Edward Ludak, and many others. So this was an open letter sent by these kind of like bigwigs within the US Washington establishment to Bill Clinton about NATO expansion, basically saying in NATO expansion, which the alliance has indicated is open-ended, will inevitably degrade NATO's ability to carry out its primary mission and involve US security guarantees to countries with serious border and national minority problems and unevenly developed systems of democratic government. So basically they're saying, NATO expansion in the post-Soviet era is a very bad idea. And the implications for the US is that NATO expansion will trigger an extended debate over its indeterminate but certainly high cost and will call into question the US commitment to the alliance, traditionally and rightly regarded as a centerpiece of US foreign policy. Because of these serious objections, and in the absence of any reason for a rapid decision, we strongly urge that the NATO expansion process be suspended while alternative actions are pursued. These include, next one, opening the economic and political doors to the European Union. So suspend the opening of economic and political doors to the European Union. Suspend developing enhanced partnership for a peace program. Or no, sorry, this is pro, wasn't it? Let me look at the other one. Sorry. What was the last line there? These are alternative actions. So opening economic and political doors to the European Union to Central and Eastern Europe, developing enhanced partnership for peace programs, supporting a cooperative NATO-Russian relationship, interesting, and continuing the arms reduction and transparency process, particularly with respect to nuclear weapons and materials, the major threat to US security, and with respect to conventional military forces in Europe. And the last line of it, Russia does not now pose a threat to its Western neighbours and the nations of Central and Eastern Europe and are not in danger. For this reason and others cited above, we believe that NATO expansion is neither necessary nor desirable, and that this ill-conceived policy can and should be put on hold. So that was the Washington, significant figures in the Washington establishment letter to Bill Clinton in 1997. Of course, it was somebody overruled them, and NATO expansion continued. And if you just go to follow on from that, go to WikiLeaks. This is 10 years later. Then, this is a declassified document. It was declassified by Ambassador William J. Burns, who at the time was ambassador to Russia, U.S. ambassador to Russia, and is today the CIA director. Was made CIA director in March, I think, last year, 2021, but for Biden. It makes kind of interesting reading. It's not very long. So following a muted first reaction to Ukraine's intent to seek NATO membership, the Membership Action Plan, MEP, Foreign Minister Lavrov, remember this is 2008, Foreign Minister Lavrov and other senior officials have reiterated strong opposition, stressing that Russia would view further eastward expansion as a potential military threat. NATO enlargement, particularly to Ukraine, remains an emotional and neuralgic issue for Russia. I don't know whether using the word neuralgic. Emotional issue for Russia. But strategic policy considerations also underline strong opposition to NATO membership. Strategic policy considerations. I wonder what they were. In Ukraine, these include fears that the issue could potentially split the country in two, leading to violence or even some claim civil war, which would force Russia to decide whether to intervene. Additionally, experts continue to claim that Ukrainian NATO membership would have a major impact on Russia's defense industry, Russian-Ukrainian family connections, and bilateral relations generally. So, this is...
You see, that is the sane analyst's assessment of the situation. But when you write that report and you send it higher up, they go, "Thank you. That is exactly why we need to do this."
But when you do it, you can't complain. When Russia, you can't, and Russia responds like they will, because you're consciously and deliberately aggravating them for no good reason, and you're causing them problems that neither you nor anyone else with any sense would ever tolerate, and would never be seen by anybody with any sense as justifiable or reasonable. And when that country then responds, so basically when you go up and punch someone in the face, you cannot turn around and say, they're hurting me by their reaction.
Yeah.
I don't care what way they perceive it. What I care about is what their grand plan is. If they have the facts and have the data, they know that this is totally unfair, unreasonable, totally undiplomatic. You know, it was definitely going to provoke Russia. It's like poking a bear. It's like provoking someone for no reason other than to provoke them more, because you might enjoy it. You might think you get something out of it. You can do that if you want. But when you get the obvious reaction, you don't try and spin it in the media and to the people of the world as if you're the one being attacked, which is what they've done.
Isn't it interesting that the person writing that report then is now the CIA director?
Exactly.
Responsible essentially for much of the US media output about Russia invading Ukraine. He knows full well, or he did know, maybe this is a good case of, power corrupts, or he's acting against his better knowledge, or...
He's just going with the flow, and he's not. And the CIA director at this point is not the one that comes in with each administration, doesn't have much sway, or he's just a ceremonial.
He's another
position almost.
gopher.
Yeah. But you just go back to that document, Scotty. Second point under NATO enlargement, potential military threat to Russia. During his annual review of Russia's foreign policy, Foreign Minister Lavrov stressed that Russia had to view continued eastward expansion of NATO, particularly to Ukraine and Georgia, as a potential military threat to Russia. While Russia might believe statements from the West that NATO was not directed against Russia, when one looked at recent military activities in NATO countries, the establishment of US forward operating locations, etc., they had to be evaluated not by stated intentions, but by their potential. Well, yeah. You can say, all those missiles and weapons that we're putting right on your border, they're not directed at you.
Yeah. Well, the media was telling Putin to his face in the 2000s, no, they're not directed at you. They're directed at Iran.
Right. On Russia's border.
There's a famous video where he laughs at the German reporter telling him this.
Right, yeah. Lavrov stressed that maintaining Russia's sphere of influence in the neighborhood was anachronistic. Notice this bit. Lavrov is there he basically admitting that talking about our sphere of influence was an anachronism, was like not really relevant, and acknowledged that the US and Europe have legitimate interests in the region. But while countries are free to make their own decisions about their security and which political military structure to join, they need to keep in mind the impact on their neighbours, which everybody agrees to.
Which is exactly what Lavrov is saying today.
Saying now.
He's saying exactly the same thing. Imagine having that
13 years later.
Saying that over
later.
and over and getting the same response.
And people just blanking and going, whatever. Lavrov emphasized that Russia was convinced that enlargement was not based on security reasons, but a legacy of the Cold War, which it is, because NATO is a Cold War organization. NATO was formed in the Cold War for Cold War purposes, i.e. against the Soviet Union, against communism. That ended 33 years ago.
Yeah.
He disputed arguments that NATO was an appropriate mechanism for helping to strengthen democratic governments. Duh. He said that Russia understood that NATO was in search of a new mission, but there was a growing tendency for new members to do and say whatever they wanted simply because they were under the NATO umbrella. During a press briefing on 22nd of January, again, this is 2008, in response to a question about Ukraine's request for NATO membership, Lavrov said a radical new expansion of NATO may bring about a serious political military shift that will inevitably affect the security interests of Russia. The spokesman went on to stress that Russia was bound with Ukraine by bilateral obligations set forth in a 1997 treaty on friendship, cooperation and partnership, in which both parties undertook to refrain from participation in or support of any actions capable of prejudicing the security of the other side. Russia and Ukraine signed an agreement to that effect, which was then trashed in 2014 when the US staged a coup in the country. Mm-hmm. The spokesman noted that Ukraine's likely integration into NATO would seriously complicate the many-sided Russian-Ukrainian relations, and that Russia would have to take appropriate measures. Opposition and neuralgic and concrete. Not only does Russia perceive encirclement and efforts to undermine its influence in the region, but it also fears unpredictable and uncontrolled consequences which would seriously affect Russian security interests. Experts tell us that Russia is particularly worried about the strong divisions in Ukraine over NATO membership, with much of the ethnic Russian community against membership could lead to a major split involving violence or at worst civil war. In that eventuality, Russia would have to decide whether to intervene. So this is the other aspect to it, is that the coup in 2014 would likely have caused some kind of civil war, and in a certain sense did. And the whole claim that Russia took Donbass, the eastern part of Ukraine, is bogus. It's those people who are the most, let's say, pro-Russian and anti-Ukrainian, extreme Ukrainian nationalism. They're the one. They would have done what they did anyway.
Yeah. But Lavrov was trying to explain to them the objective facts of the situation here.
Yeah.
Which hold. They held then and they do today. And they held in 1997 in the earlier statement that those senior retired think tankers were trying to warn the Clinton administration.
Right.
We have an assessment of the objective facts on the ground vis-a-vis Russia-Ukrainian relations. Expanding NATO to include it is just, it's a lose-lose.
Right.
Not,
you're just creating chaos and
we
war.
lose as well.
Yeah.
We don't win from it. That
Right.
was known 30 years ago in the United States and understood well in Washington.
And someone went
But
ahead with it
inexorably,
anyway.
we've come to this situation where the objective facts of what would happen are coming true. Of course, all you hear about is the agency of Putin. Putin's doing it, Putin's doing it, Putin's led us all this
Right.
way. No, that's
all
the
been
reality. This
orchestrated
would have
by the
happened
US.
without Putin.
Yeah, it's all been orchestrated by the US. I mean, the agency is all on the US's side. You know, Russia responds to what America does. If you go back to the WikiLeaks that cable, experts tell us, this is down just before 6, a little bit above there. Experts tell us that Russia is particularly worried that this. I already read this, but I just want to reiterate it. Experts tell us that Russia is particularly worried that the strong divisions in Ukraine over NATO membership, which much of the ethnic Russian community are against, could lead to a major split involving violence or at worst civil war. In that eventuality, Russia would have to decide whether to intervene, a decision Russia does not want to have to face. That was true in 2018 and it was true in 2014. But the US forced Russia to take a decision
Yeah.
that it did not want to have to take.
Yeah.
And was on record as not and made the essence of this document clear. And this comes from obviously the US ambassador at the time and now the CIA director's analysis of it at the time in 2018. But those
2008.
points, 2008. But those ideas and those points were made by the Russians directly on multiple occasions to the US. They basically said, listen, don't come in and basically take over Ukraine. Don't do anything in Ukraine to destabilize Ukraine. The connections between Ukraine and Russia are too strong. Familial ties, ethnic ties, business ties. If you go in there, you're just going to create chaos and you might cause a civil war. And we don't want to have to intervene in a civil war in Ukraine. That's what the Russians said.
Yeah.
But then America goes ahead and does precisely that. And then when Russia is forced to intervene minimally to defend the people of Donbass, who are the ones who would have engaged in a war against the coup, the new coup administration, Russia is accused of being the aggressor and trying to absorb Ukraine. I'm telling you, it's 180 degrees.
Yeah.
It's exactly the opposite of what they say, and that's why I keep saying it. People, when I say that, people think, yeah, that's a funny thing to say. No, I'm serious. Flip it on its head.
Yeah.
The data argues for anybody being able to flip official narratives from the US about what's going on in the world on its head to get much closer and sometimes exactly on the truth of the situation. There's also other things in here. Can we encourage the metal simulating US over blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Point number 7, another issue driving Russian opposition to Ukrainian membership is the significant defense industry cooperation the two countries share, including a number of plants where Russian weapons are made. While efforts are underway to shut down or move most of these plants to Russia and to move the Black Sea Fleet from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk, whatever, earlier than the 2007 deadline, the GOR has made clear that Ukraine's joining NATO would require Russia to make major costly changes to its defense industrial cooperation. So this was obviously an attack on the Russian economy and the Russian defense industry as well, by taking Ukraine away from it. But the interesting thing about that is the mention of 2017 deadline. That was when the original 25-year lease of Sevastopol by Ukraine, on a friendly lease of Sevastopol for Russia's Black Sea Fleet, was destined to end. Was up for renewal, and they had kind of agreed even before. This is 2008. Let's say this is being mentioned. Russia, even in 2008, was already beginning plans to move its Black Sea Fleet out of Sevastopol in advance of that deadline, when they would no longer have it, because it was kind of agreed, even with a friendly government in Ukraine, it was agreed that between Russia and a friendly government in Ukraine, that Crimea would no longer host the Black Sea Fleet.
But if that's the case, doesn't that undercut the argument for why the US went in 2014? Why wouldn't the US just wait until 2017?
Exactly.
And then Crimea is no longer Russia's access way into the Black Sea.
Yeah, well, they don't.
That's why I don't. That's
have,
why I wonder if it was really about getting Russia out of Crimea.
It was one
because they would have always had that backup plan. They would still have had Black Sea coastline, Sochi.
It was one part of it, but I don't think you're probing the depths of the pathology in the American mind here, and they're anti-Russian. They knew that Russia was going to move its Black Sea Fleet from Sevastopol in 2017. So before they could do that, they wanted to take it.
Right. So there would be no Black Sea Fleet. They'd have to rebuild or from scratch. I see. I mean, that's just supremely greedy and stupid.
Not greedy. It's extremely aggressive and just. I mean, it's beyond. It's beyond any reason. Like it's. I mean, you can start to understand just the attitude of the Russians towards the Americans, knowing what they know about what they do and how they go about it, and the deviousness of them and their insanity. I mean, the Russians have in recent years come out and more or less said that we're starting to think that these people are insane.
Yeah.
They're not joking. They're not using that term lightly. These people are nuts. They have lost their minds. I mean, they obviously in that situation found it hard to understand, to the extent that you've taken Crimea away from Russia, or taken all of Ukraine plus Crimea away from Russia. Why they wouldn't just wait? If the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol and Crimea was a major issue, just wait. We're going to be gone in 2017. No, that's not the only thing. Sure, it'd be good for us to kind of get in there and cause you serious problems by basically taking over the country in a coup and kicking you out and denying you access to it and putting you on the back foot. Basically, it'd be cool to do that. But obviously, there's other aspects in terms of, or even bigger aspects in terms of. It would give them a problem in terms of not just the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol and Crimea, but also the population in Crimea, a few million people, all absolutely, the vast majority of them absolutely see themselves as Russian and speak Russian and see themselves as ethnically Russian and have long desired to actually become part of Russia. You're screwed with them as well, and they're basically now, kind of a captive of this Ukrainian, right-wing anti-Russian government that they installed in 2014.
Yeah.
And just across the board, it was going to give Russia serious headache. And that's not even mentioning then the implication of putting missiles all over Ukraine. So it's a really seriously dirty move and dirty plan. And Russia was absolutely justified in doing. They could have done so much more. They should have done not they should have done, but they could have. They would have been entitled or justified in doing so much more than what they actually did. They only did as much as was necessary.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of thing you're dealing with,
Jesus, it's like looking at it over 3 decades. It's like this steamroller. I mean. And we know that Washington knows the objective facts about it. And it seems when you put them side by side with what we've seen happen in recent years, that a psychopathic mind in Washington used those facts specifically to create that situation where Russia is forced to decide. And here we are today. Russia is basically faced with a decision, and you've got the whole media apparatus baiting them. Go on, invade. Go on, invade. That's the decision they want. They're weighting it towards that, or towards some military action, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's more. This cable's really interesting. There's just a little bit more at the end. If you just go down to point number 10, the GOR, that's Russia, basically, has made it clear that it would have to seriously review its entire relationship with Ukraine and Georgia in the event of NATO inviting them to join. This could include major impacts on energy, economic and political military engagement, with possible repercussions throughout the region and into Central and Western Europe. Russia would also likely revisit its own relationship with the alliance and activities in the NATO-Russian Council, and consider further actions in the arms control arena, including the possibility of complete withdrawal from the CFE and the INF treaties, and more direct threats against US missile defence plans. And the last point at number 11, more or less, Isabelle Francois, director of the NATO Information Office in Moscow, said she believed that Russia had accepted that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually join NATO and was engaged in long-term planning to reconfigure its relations with both countries and with the alliance. However, Russia was not yet ready to deal with the consequences of further NATO enlargement to its south. She added that while Russia liked the cooperation with NATO in the NATO-Russia Council, Russia would feel it necessary to insist on recasting the NATO-Russia relationship, if not completely withdraw completely from the NRC in the event of Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO. So they knew all this. They knew everything, and they knew all of the implications. They knew all of the dangers. They knew the dangers to Western Europe of pushing Russia in this way, by pushing NATO, pushing the US, its adversary, its stated declared adversary, for no good reason, right up to Russia's borders and putting missiles in the countries right on Russia's borders. They knew it all long before 2008. This is 2008, but they knew it before then, which is why that letter to Bill Clinton from those hawks, basically former hawks, were all saying, really bad idea, don't do it. So who did it? Who, against all evidence, against all reason, against all sense of ideas of security, international security, peace in Europe, who saw that the one way to screw all of that up, to screw up security, international security, screw up peace in Europe, to ignite the flames of potential war, to cause war and death, who saw all of that and said, yeah, that's what we're going to do. Who did it? Who said it? While many voices in the overt political establishment in the US were saying, don't do it.
Well,
someone went ahead and did it.
Take your pick. Newland's husband, Donald Kagan, Charles Krauthammer, now deceased, John McCain, Brzezinski.
Yeah.
I don't think that letter is exceptional. The one in 97 asking Bill Clinton to reconsider this is exceptional. Washington as a whole, really does see itself as a shining city on a hill. Mm-hmm. They have a world outlook. It's an empire. They are Rome. Mm-hmm. These people are totally infused with it.
And they want the same fate as Rome, do they?
Apparently.
Because that seems to be what you get.
They think they know it, and they think they can avoid it. But it's the hubris that comes with the territory of being, quote, the new Rome.
Do you know who George Kennan is?
Yeah. He basically pioneered containment.
He was Mr. Basically, yeah.
One of the six wise men,
right,
post-war.
Put up the New York Times. This is from even further back now. We're going back 25 years. This is by Friedman, who is, a bit of a hawk himself. He's not much of a politician as opposed to as a historian or whatever, or a political commentator. But he was called X. George Friedman was... George Kennan, was, like you just said, the kind of one of the founders of NATO, and the idea of, he was there at the creation of NATO, part of it, and the idea of containment of the Soviet Union throughout the whole Cold War era. And this is Friedman his comment, an article, opinion, obviously, in New York Times, 1998, on NATO expansion around the time that letter was written to Clinton. So he says, so he calls up Kennan, who at this point is 94 years old. He says he's as sharp as ever, and he wants his reaction to the Senate's ratification of NATO expansion. So despite all of the pushback against NATO expansion, the Senate ratifies NATO expansion in 1998. And this man, who's the architect of America's successful containment of the Soviet Union and one of the great American statesmen of the 20th century, was ready with an answer. And here's what he said. I think it is the beginning of a new Cold War. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely and it will affect their policies. I think it is a tragic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. This expansion would make the founding fathers of our country turn over in their graves. We have signed up to protect a whole series of countries even though we have neither the resources nor the intention to do so in any serious way. NATO expansion was simply a light-hearted action by a Senate that has no real interest in foreign affairs. What bothers me is how superficial and ill-informed the whole Senate debate was. I was particularly bothered by the reference to Russia as a country dying to attack Western Europe. 1998. Don't people understand? Our differences in the Cold War were with the Soviet communist regime. And now we are turning our backs on the very people who mounted the greatest bloodless revolution in history to remove the Soviet regime. And Russia's democracy is as far advanced, if not farther, as any of these countries which just signed up to defend from Russia. It shows so little understanding of Russian history and Soviet history. Of course there is going to be a bad reaction from Russia. And then the NATO expanders will say that we always told you that is how the Russians are.
Which is precisely what happened.
Which is
precisely what
and
happened.
this guy wrote the book on it, right? He was like Mr. Cold War.
Mr. Cold War, but isn't it interesting that he himself, in his 90 years, and was once US ambassador to the USSR actually, went to his grave ignorant of the actuality, the geopolitical actuality. He really thought this was the ideological war between those communists and us Western free capitalists.
Well, for most of them it was, you know.
But when you have the exact same underlying pattern remain in place 4 decades hence.
Well, he's just saying it's a terrible idea. It's a bad idea. Why are these people doing it? He's criticizing them all, but he's not giving an explanation as to why. He's not asked why they're doing this, right?
But it means that he genuinely believed it was to contain communism.
At the time.
Yes.
Well, it was. But the two go together. You can't separate the two.
But when the same things continue,
Then
when
you
you
find out,
remove
but he died in
communism.
2003, so he didn't see all of this. All he saw was the
But
Senate signing
what
off
I'm
on
getting
NATO
at is that he
expansion.
was used by people who did know better.
Yeah.
People who understood the essence of Mackinder's theories.
We'll go down to the...
He who controls the heartland controls the world island, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. We'll just go down to
Mackinder wrote that pre-communism.
Yeah, for sure, yeah. Of course it's about domination of the globe, and then you have a narrative over the top of it, and the narrative isn't just made up, it's not spurious, it's not, right, because there was obviously a problem with communism, and in the sense of, in the way that it was, and at least whether it was communism or not, the way it was practiced and the way people lived their lives in communist countries and stuff, I mean, you can't deny the experience they had compared to the experience people were having in the West. Do you know what I mean? So there was a rationale, is what I'm saying, that was fairly convincing and did have facts to back it up, apparent evidence to back it up. But this was an ideological war rather than a geopolitical one, just for pure control, you know. But hold that thought. I'll just show you. It's the very last sentence in that article, Scotty. We just down the very bottom, just in answer to your question. As he said goodbye to me on the phone, Mr. Kennan added just one more thing. This has been my life, and it pains me to see it so screwed up in the end. So the best he could do was say that it's all been screwed up.
Yeah.
At the point where he was saying, he died in 2003, he had some very negative comments about the Iraq invasion as well, although he died before it happened. But in 1998, 5 years before he died, and seeing the Senate ratify the NATO expansion to Western Europe, he's saying this is all screwed up. I mean, this is diverging completely from reality, is what he was saying. What are these people doing? You know. So
Yeah.
to a certain extent, he maybe realized that he had been, not that he'd been used, but that there were other people who were exploiting or were using the situation for an agenda that was not the agenda that he was pushing, right? Because I think that's a big one to ask people to really go, you know what I mean? Especially someone who spent 70 years of his life probably involved directly in it, and especially through the whole Cold War era, to expect them to kind of admit to themselves that it was all just that was only, to remove the communist thing completely.
I get it. He went to his death a believer, or a disillusioned believer by the end.
That what he had done was
But this
right thing.
speaks to the fundamental lack of insight. Because pre-Soviet Russia, I'm telling you, I read a book on this. I don't have data to hand, but I think even Kennan himself, his father or uncle, was a missionary in Imperial Russia. And they were saying the same kinds of things. These Russians, man, we got to either keep them back or get in here and regime change this place. This is a problem for us, blah, 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 blah. He would have grown up in a culture that said similar things in the ideological set of values that precedes the communist war.
Well, so back preceding the Cold War, pre-World War II, what was the West?
Pre-World War One, before Russia went Bolshevik.
Yeah, pre-World War One. Yeah, before 1917. What was the ideological? What was the problem? The West problem with Tsarist Russia, let's say.
Oh, they said such similar things.
They couldn't accuse them of communism for a start.
No, they would speak out of both corners of their mouths. They would say they're backward, they're not democratic, they're not really Christian. They had a problem with orthodoxy. Let's send missionaries over. We can convert them to our ways, get them right, you know. At the other corner of their mouth, it was like, this place is too big. Holy smokes, this is going to be a serious threat to, our long-term interest, that kind of thing. If I knew we were going to talk about it, I'd definitely have the book to hand. The book, I'll look up the name of it. It's such an eye-opener. And the same, Washington is patrician families, like Rome at the end, And Kennan has relatives in Imperial Russia saying similar-ish things, but in the different terminology and rationale of its day about the problem of Russia's size and its at the same time, other corner of the mouth, of its lack of proper religion, proper view of the world. They're not us.
It's not really credible,
it's the other.
Proper religion. It's closer to the original Christianity than...
Oh, I can't remember the name of the book. Damn it. Anyway, it's an awesome book because
we'll put it in the show
puts
notes.
150 years of perspective of how Washington views Russia.
We'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, I know, we shouldn't, you're right, I shouldn't criticize Kennan with hindsight. That's genuine, it's heartfelt, but it speaks to the fundamental lack of insight that I mentioned earlier. That you don't have the culture in Washington that you do in Moscow that can assess a situation objectively, even though my own interests are in the center of it. Lavrov is a Russian. Of course, you would say, of course he's going to say those things about it. Well, what he said in 2008 is exactly what happened. And of course, the response to that, people were, well, yeah, he was an agent involved in helping that along. Well, that's BS. It would, if it wasn't Lavrov, it would be someone else in Russia.
No, I mean, he outlined what was going to happen. Not only he outlined, but think tankers and politicians and analysts in the US outlined what was going to happen. So what's incredible is that, of course, it's not incredible. It is incredible, I suppose, if to think that people don't know anything about this extant history, stuff that's on the internet, it's in official records, it's part of official history. People who don't know that think that can be sold the bullshit narrative that we're getting today, which is that Russia is the aggressor, blah 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 blah. When again, pick your decade, 1998 or 2008. at either of those two times over a period, that's literally, or even you go back 20 years, from 2008, you go back to the fall of the Soviet Union. But at any point during that time, it was made explicit by Russia and known explicitly by US governments, US administrations, that if we follow this course, we're going to run into a conflict with Russia. And this course doesn't have to be followed. It'll be followed just almost whimsically or superficially for no real advantage that anybody's willing to talk about, at least. So why would we do it? And then when they go ahead and follow that ridiculous, mindless, reckless course towards provoking Russia, Russia then responds in the way they predict Russia was going to respond, as you would predict anybody was going to respond. It's like, write up a paper saying, if I go and attack my neighbour's house, my neighbour is likely to attack me back or to defend his house. And here's all the consequences for the neighbourhood that would happen. You can, work out your whole scenario. And then come to the conclusion that, I don't really have any interest in attacking my neighbour, and certainly all those negative consequences will be bad for everybody. Should be the end of the story, right? But then you find that you decide to go ahead and do it. And then when your neighbour responds to being attacked in the way that you predicted, you blame him.
That's it, in a nutshell. Yeah.
And
we have a comment here regarding the book. Aeneas says, would it be this book, Towards the Flame, Empire, War, and the End of Tsarist Russia?
Nope.
Don't.
It's a very specific niche book. It's specifically about how official Washington, and maybe more broadly the American intellectual scene, so there's some cultural stuff as well, how it perceived Russia over a span of 150 years. It's fascinating because there's a set, it doesn't just obviously give you the comparison with Cold War perspectives with today, which are obviously very similar, and all that's removed is essentially, as they would say it, well, Russia's still the same essential thing, they just remove the ideological cloak. Same beast, But what makes it even more fascinating is that the preceding era had the same attitudes in official Washington to so late Tsarist Imperial Russia.
Yeah. So it's
I can't even remember keywords, I'm afraid, to give you, so I'll have to just stick it.
Yeah, I mean, the scenario you're presenting there of pre-Soviet, pre-communist Russia, not Soviet Russia, well, pre-communist Russia, so pre-First World War, that the West, at least for several decades, had the same attitude towards Russia as they did during the Cold War, under the guise of fighting against communism, and in Cold War Part 2 now, under the guise of fighting against Russian aggression. So the question is, the question you're bringing up then in that context, when you see like pre-communism and post-communism, the attitude to Russia is the same. Does that suggest then that communism as a rationale for fighting, just as an interim period or as the middle period of this long war against Russia by the West, does the communism thing just stick out as a kind of like a barely plausible narrative? Should it stick out as a barely plausible narrative, If I've been attacking, again, I'll use my dodgy attacking my neighbour analogy, if I've been attacking my neighbour for 30 years, in the first 10 years I had no good reason other than I just wanted his stuff.
Yeah.
In the second 10 years, it was because he had become a jihadi, according to me, and I was fighting against him for religious and other ideological reasons. And then he dropped his religion, and the last 10 years he just went back to being a normal person. And my reason then was just because I want the same reason, which was go back to the first reason, which was I wanted his stuff, or he's an aggressor, or some made up story, right? If there's the middle part of an ideological war that was justified, does that actually stand up? If before that and after that, you're still attacking the person for reasons other than that, which are just kind of more spurious, made up reasons.
Well, look at it this way. If in the first 10-year period, you're beating the crap out of him, and he's basically taking it, just taking it. And in the second year, he says, you know what? I'm going to get armed. I'm going to call myself the Neighborhood Community Liberation Army. We're going to have a red uniform with stars on it, and we're going to fight back at these mofos. That's basically it. Now, it's not just that, but 1917 was weird.
Yeah.
It wasn't just organic, internal. Russians just didn't embrace this extreme ideology that gave rise to the USSR. There was a lot of stuff going on. There wasn't even a civil war. There were actually 3 equal parts to the Russian Civil War. It was so insane. There was the white traditional Tsarist. That's what they called themselves, the whites, not that they were white. Trying to maintain the status quo. You had the Bolsheviks, the red communist ideologues coming in. No, this is not just revolution here. It's going to be revolution everywhere. And you had the Greens. No one knows about the Greens, but the Greens were basically synonymous today with the vast hinterland of the United States. That's red. It's basically people not in the cities, farmers, working class, the working class who weren't pulled in the cities, everywhere else in Russia. And they armed themselves, they organized. That's why it was such a brutal event that marked Russia for the next 80 years. Because there was a tri-civil war between 3 major countries.
There is suggestion that was, to one extent or another, manipulated. I mean, the evidence for it is fairly scant, although there have been books written on it, but that the October Revolution, or the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, was to at least some extent facilitated and encouraged and by outside forces, i.e. Western forces, you know.
Yeah.
And of course, it's never as simple as people think it's imposed on a country. When you say something happens like that where it's facilitated from the outside, you think, well, that doesn't sound plausible, because you can't just go in and have a country start a civil war all by itself. You have to, it has to be quite involved, you know, to get that to happen. But very often it's exploiting conditions within the country or groups within the country. So there's the potential, I suppose. I mean, there is the potential in any country for a civil war if you can exacerbate the tensions, and that's where the external influence comes from. You know what I mean? And then if you throw in weapons and pile some or push some people into the country with weapons and money, you can start something going. And once you start something going like that, it can quickly snowball.
Exactly.
So it doesn't mean you have to organize the whole civil war all yourself. You know what I mean? That's the way some people interpret it. Like when they say it's an oversimplified idea of external influences. Facilitating, let's say, a civil war in a country. It's not that the external influence or external forces did the civil war, fought the civil war. They simply provoked it at a time when it was right.
It's
maybe.
a key element, though. If, for example, if this kind of thing had happened in France in 2018, the French flag would now be a yellow vest. If there had been an external supplier of weapons and money and media support, the regime was toast. Yeah. Same in Canada right now. If you stoked it, you have to stoke with violence to get Canadians to go from just being nice protesters to actually wanting to do something about the situation.
Turn into Truckistan.
It is ripe right now, all things being equal, and there was an international marketplace for coming in and just adding, the money and the weapons it needs. It'd be a very cost-effective way to convert an entire country into a new regime. And that goes for many places in the West at the moment.
Yeah, that's why they're so paranoid about it, right? That's why they keep talking about Russia.
They keep talking about Russia, but Russia doesn't do what it's accused of. If it would have, France would have fallen by now, Canada, and who knows where else.
America does it, though. Yeah.
But maybe we're getting too far. But the basic change from communist time to modern Russia is enough alone. As Putin has pointed out many times, in the 90s, we capitulated to the point that there were actual CIA people in our cabinet. They ran the country. They had the full, and they ran it into the ground. Russia reached it basically reached the bottom of the barrel in 1998 when they defaulted on their loans to the IMF.
And that's when they decided on NATO expansion.
Yeah, at their weakest point. Yeah. 1998. Then
And they could do nothing
Putin is
about it.
elevated to prime minister
In
1999.
1999.
Then he's caretaker president. That was the beginning of something in Russia coalesced around, okay, look, Yeltsin and his family,
Yeah.
we have to...
But the idea of running it into the ground, yeah, I mean, when it was under the stewardship of the US and its allies and its proxies for several years in the 90s, yeah, it was running to the ground because those people were not Russian. They had no allegiance to the country. They didn't care about the country, and that's where the idea of nationalism comes from. That you have to have people who live in the country, care about the country, see themselves, identify as ethnically or ethnically from there, and see that country as their own. So they have a sense of respect and a desire to have the country improve because it's theirs. It's as close to them as their own skin type thing, But you put in somebody else, you put in other groups into a country, and they will destroy it. And that's the purpose of those groups, of funneling groups into other countries that you want to destroy, because you can be sure they'll destroy it because they don't give a shit about the country because they're not from the country.
Yeah. Yeah. I think Putin's been onto this since very early on.
Yeah.
I accept the kind of basic explanation of it is that he began by testing the waters, and he himself has evolved to this point of a very hard-nosed attitude towards the West. But there's clips that pop up now and again. Somebody posted one, I think, on the Russia Insight YouTube channel. It's Putin in 2002 speaking in a closed meeting that happened to be filmed. And the subs say that he's telling a bunch of wealthy Russian businessmen, the time is coming where you don't want to have your assets abroad. You're going to be biting dust or something like that. You don't want to be left. You don't want to be left with nothing when that time comes. You're talking about sanctions and what the targeted stuff, what the kinds of things that they're going to do in response, probably to me putting my foot down.
Yeah, well, I mean, they were well versed. They watched America do all sorts of everything they did during the Cold War in the name of fighting communism. They did a lot of the stuff that they've been doing over the past 20 years in different countries: Iraq, Libya, Syria, and the tactics against Russia and China. I mean, the U.S. did all of that for most of the Cold War era against different countries around the world, and the Soviets just kind of sat there and watched it all happen. So they had a good lesson for several decades and how America, and it progressively, did it more and more as it got more and more influence and more and more power. It kept doing it, So yeah, it wasn't hard to figure out, let's say. But again, the problem in the West is that nobody in the West, especially the journalists and politicians and most politicians, don't know this history, don't understand it, don't see it from that perspective. They don't see it from a perspective from outside the US. They only see it from internally, from a very subjective perspective. And of course, they're fed on lies and the idea of the American dream and American freedom and democracy and all that kind of stuff. And their view of the world is very detached from reality. And I think reality is going to come back and bite them very soon. It is right now, I think, over this Russia-Ukraine situation. They're running up against a reality that they've ignored for a long time.
Do you think we got a clue from the US government this week about what they're going to do next? In the form of that declassified intelligence report that says Russia could, at any moment, conduct a false flag attack in or near Ukraine. Do you want to?
Yeah.
Do you want to play this?
Yeah.
Which one? We've got Curveball Kirby at the Pentagon or Ned CIA Price.
I mean, he's the Alex Jones one, yeah.
The thing is, that one's 7 minutes long, though. Matt Lee, of course, his responses are funny, but that exchange overall is 7 minutes.
Well, we can do a little bit of it.
Okay, can you play this, Scotty? This is the State Department spokesman, Ned Price, who was, in fact, a CIA errand boy for in the 2000s.
We have previously noted our strong concerns regarding Russian disinformation and the likelihood that Moscow might seek to create a false flag operation to initiate military activity. Now, we can say that the United States has information that Russia is planning to stage fabricated attacks by Ukrainian military or intelligence forces as a pretext for a further invasion of Ukraine. One possible option the Russians are considering, and which we made public today, involves the production of a propaganda video, a video with graphic scenes of false explosions, depicting corpses, crisis actors pretending to be mourners, and images of destroyed locations or military equipment, entirely fabricated by Russian intelligence. To be clear, the production of this propaganda video is one of a number of options that the Russian government is developing as a fake pretext to initiate and potentially justify military aggression against Ukraine. We don't know if Russia will necessarily use this or another option in the coming days. We are publicizing it now, however, in order to lay bare the extent of Russia's destabilizing actions towards Ukraine and to dissuade Russia from continuing this dangerous campaign and ultimately launching a military attack. Russia has signaled it's willing to continue diplomatic talks as a means to de-escalate, but actions...
Yeah, I mean, he said there's various there's only one of many possible scenarios, possible plans that Russia has, but apparently this is the best one.
Yeah.
This is the most important one and the most likely one, because that's the only one we're talking about. We're not mentioning the others. And what he's doing, for people who had obviously, well, people who haven't picked up on it, although it'll be hard not to pick up on it, but he's basically voicing their something that has until now, over the most of the year of the internet, and until today, I suppose, until the time that he said this, he's voicing something that was immediately dismissed as crazy tinfoil hat conspiracy theory. Mm-hmm. That anybody, anywhere, any major nation or any, would basically fake, complete with crisis actors, fake some kind of an attack, a bloody attack with crisis actors. That means fake dead bodies, fake blood, fake, people crying, fake victims, all that kind of stuff. And until, like I said, until now, that was the domain of crazy conspiracy theories. But apparently it's a reality according to the State Department, or the Department of Defense, actually.
Can we skip forward to the end of the statement? I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see where it is, though. I
It's
can't
about
remember.
in the middle, no? Or go from the middle.
Evidence that this is like crisis actors, really? This is like to confirm.
Conduct a false flag operation in eastern Ukraine. So that, Matt, to your question, is an action that Russia has already taken.
It's an action that you say that they have taken, but you have shown no evidence to confirm that. And I'm going to get to the next question here, which is, what is the evidence that they... this is like crisis actors, really? This is like Alex Jones territory you're getting into. What evidence do you have to support the idea that there is some propaganda film in the making?
Matt, this is derived from information known to the U.S. government, intelligence information that we have declassified. I think you know...
Okay, well, where is it? Where is this information?
It is intelligence information that we have declassified.
Well, where is it? Where's the declassified information?
I just delivered it.
No, you made a series of allegations and statements.
Would you like us to print out the topper? Because you will see a transcript of this briefing that you can print out for yourself.
That's not evidence, Ned. That's you saying it. That's not evidence. I'm sorry.
You can't understand that what him saying stuff is not evidence.
That you can show that
Matt, you have been
that shows that the Russians are doing this. Ned, I've been doing this for a long time.
I know, that was my point. You have been doing this for quite a while. You know that when we declassify intelligence information, we do so in a means. We do so with an eye to protecting sources and methods.
Is not going to fall. I remember a lot of things. So where is the declassified information other than you coming out here and saying?
Matt, I'm sorry you don't like the format, but we have declassified.
It's not the format; it's the content.
I'm sorry you don't like the content. I'm sorry you are doubting the information that is in the possession of the U.S. government.
No,
what I'm telling you is that this is information that's available to us. We are making it available to you in order for a couple reasons. One,
he just goes on, and it's just back and forth, and he can't get an answer to his question. It's like, where is the evidence? Can you give me any evidence? Can you show me any evidence that this is that Russia is planning this? But the interesting thing, he said the Alex Jones thing. You're into Alex Jones territory here, and Matt Lee there is kind of like incredulous because he's like, dude, because the response to him saying to Matt Lee saying this is Alex Jones territory, he said the response was, no, this is the information that the US government has. So the US government has, at least now, and maybe we can assume that in the past, evidence that some things that Alex Jones and people like him were saying, that they had that information as well, that it was valid information, despite the fact that Alex Jones has become the poster boy for crazy conspiracy theories, and everything's all made up, and he's crazy, he's nuts. What he says is totally detached from reality. But now it's not, because it's information that the US government and intelligence agencies have.
Yeah. It's harsh on Alex Jones because he's infamous for saying that Sandy Hook was crisis actors, fake, staged, there were no real deaths, etc., etc. He's since retracted it very publicly, clearly, I think he was taken to court as well. It was a court case. Hence, the tying of Alex Jones, that people would have heard that nationwide in America, the reference to Sandy Hook, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But the thing is, where did that concept come from? False flag stuff in the alternative media only ever became kind of an angle of looking at domestic incidents in the United States because there was a 5-decade-long history of the United States intelligence services conducting these kinds of operations abroad.
Mm-hmm.
And let's go fast forward to today. We don't have to go far back. The white helmets
Right.
were caught. BBC and other outlets basically admitted they were also swept up in these staged operations where there were actors used at the alleged scene of a Syrian bombing or a Russian bombing of a hospital.
Or chemical attack.
Yeah. So it's very much a real thing. But yeah, like you said, the code, the omerta, the code of silence on this is you don't talk about it.
Right, or you dismiss
But
it.
on the international arena, Russia busted it wide open,
Yeah.
so to speak, by showing evidence that the United States indeed engages on this, in exactly this kind of thing abroad.
Yeah.
And now it's all flipped back around, and they're trying to use that against Russia preemptively, such that if there is a provocation in Ukraine that does require a Russian military intervention, they're suggesting that whatever Russia shows you about an atrocity that's taking place in Crimea, Donbass, or elsewhere, it's not real. Russia has staged that so that when it responds, it's quote unquote justified internationally. So it's bizarre. What's bizarre to me is that they put it out there and it was allowed. We noticed that it was carried as a headline at the top of CNN,
Yep,
BBC, The
BBC,
Guardian,
yep.
New York Times for about 12 hours. And then it just went away. And the next thing came in this week. They shouted it, but not too loud either.
Yeah, yeah.
They,
Then
they-
keep it going.
they must, I don't know, they must know themselves, like, this is a risky play.
Yeah, maybe, but they're so consumed with their own,
Yeah.
abilities to control and push the narrative that they figure they can keep it on the level. But I mean, it obviously, for any thinking person, there aren't many thinking people out there these days, but for any thinking person who will accept that that's how reality, the next step is, okay, does America ever do that? Has America ever conceived of that? All the allegations over the years of America having engaged in these kind of false flag attacks, is there any validity to them, given that the US government has just said that they are valid, just not by us, or in this case by Russia? So if it's a thing, has America ever done it? So do we have to revisit all of the claimed false flag attacks of whatever kind, terror attacks, anything, and look to see if there's any validity to them? And the next step is, okay, they're talking about Russia making a video, but if you're into that kind of thing, surely an option would be not just control it in the sense of making a video and putting the video out there, but actually carrying out an attack, a real attack. So it's not faked, but it's faked in the sense of, because the essence of a false flag attack is not that there's no actual attack. Usually the essence of a false flag attack is that the attack actually happens, people die, But the person that it's ascribed to is not the person who did it. In fact, it's the person who's accusing others of having done this are the ones who have done it. That's the basic idea of a terror attack, and that gets to things like Sandy Hook and other things where it's not that kids didn't die, or in any other terror attack people weren't killed. It's that who did it is the person or persons that the government or the authorities say did it. Are they the ones who actually did it, or was it the authorities themselves?
Yeah.
Is the question. This is a simple idea. It's a simple question. It's not an unreasonable thing to suggest, except if you just think if you've been convinced or been programmed to believe that those things can never happen, that no one would ever do such a thing, that no human being would ever conceive of attacking and killing someone and then blaming someone else.
Yeah.
But that does happen in life, right? I mean, not even in mundane life.
Yeah. It's fascinating that the conflation of those two things, a false flag attack being actually an actual event in which the flag of someone else, usually your real opponent, is planted on it, with something else, which is the complete creation out of whole cloth of an atrocity from scratch. I say it's interesting to conflate the two because that is exactly what most Westerners, Americans, not only Americans, Westerners at all, who do go down this rabbit hole, in quotes, they end up making that mistake. They're confused by the two. They use the two terms interchangeably. It's different things. And here you have, and of course, it's been bashed in the last 15, 20 years of the internet age as fake news, outrageous conspiracy theories online, and roundly attack in official media and official culture, which, looks down its nose at it and basically scoffs at it. If not, they didn't even need to outright criminalize it, although there were actual court cases that come out of the Sandy Hook thing. But in general, it's just, that's lunacy.
Well, I mean, as that goes, go ahead.
Well, that's a kind of culture of it speaks to the confusion in a culture, in a population that knows something is wrong, that knows that there are habitual atrocities that are committed, there's questions about them. They're really dubious. The major mass shootings in the United States, any number of these terrorist attacks ascribed to ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the last 20 years, you just need to read two reports, official reports, side by side to see, well, there's discrepancies, for God's sake, And it bred a culture of questioning, which the official culture responded by saying, outrageous conspiracy theories, you're all mental.
It's a whole topic and almost area of research onto itself, you know what I mean? Because there's so many different ways that it can happen. You can, if you take the idea of just a false flag attack, it has different permutations, different applications. I mean, you can have like Al-Qaeda. You could say that if Al-Qaeda carries out some kind of a terror attack somewhere, it doesn't mean that wasn't Al-Qaeda or some people who swore an oath to Al-Qaeda and went and did something and went and killed some people or planted a bomb or blew something up. But you have to go back to, do they have any help?
Yeah.
Who helped them to do it? How did they get through those checkpoints? How did they, that kind of thing, So there's different variations of it. There's the pure one, almost like this guy in the Pentagon is saying, where it's just made up by your enemy or this evil actor, whoever you describe it as, and they just make up a video and they fabricate the whole thing and put it out there. And then there's another angle where Russia could actually send in some Russian operatives into Ukraine and kill people in Donbass, the people they're supposedly want to protect.
Yeah.
So then you have real footage, and they could allow Ukrainian media in to show that it's not fake. These are real dead people. This is verified as this was an actual bombing or whatever. But the narrative is that it's blamed on Ukrainian forces, which justifies a Russian response. It also has echoes of 9/11, I mean, not going into deep conspiracy theories about 9/11, but I mean, it's officially recognized that Saudi Arabia probably had something to do with the 9/11 attackers. But, so to the extent that Saudi Arabia was to whatever extent responsible for the 9/11 attacks, that was a false flag. The narrative makes it a false flag attack because Al-Qaeda was blamed rather than Saudi Arabia. You know what I mean? There's a separation completely from
Yeah.
between Saudi Arabia and Al-Qaeda, but the US government accepted, admitted. It was a court case basically where, you know, people, I don't know if it ever got resolved, but victims of, family members of the victims of 9/11, of the 9/11 attacks took a court case against Saudi Arabia for being responsible for killing their family members in the
Yeah.
9/11 attacks. But it was, well, who was it? Al-Qaeda, associated with Iraq, with Afghanistan. It was basically Afghanistan and then Iraq who were responsible for 9/11, right?
Right. That
Was that a false flag? I mean, if you put Iraq and the Afghan and Iraq flag on 9/11, is that a false flag then? To the extent that it wasn't really, or certainly it wasn't Iraq, certainly it wasn't Afghanistan, the country. It was a bunch of, you have to put an Al-Qaeda flag on it
yeah.
to follow the official narrative, but there's evidence that there should be a Saudi flag in there. So
Yeah.
it might not be a false flag, but there's flags missing from 9/11.
Yeah. Yeah. It's more complex than the time when the term was first used,
Right.
which was it was a naval reference where a ship would go in and do a bomb a harbor or another ship
Flying a
and
different flag.
flying a different flag
Right.
than it's actually representing on its boat.
Right.
We're now in the 21st century and it's complex. What is Al-Qaeda? It's a database. A database of what? Well, it's a global network of, you know, it gets murky. But there is a pure form reference to the kind that Ned Price detailed in his declassification briefing. And it's been in Americans' faces. They know it. They know it so well. There's a cultural reference to it. Wag the Dog, a 1998 Hollywood movie, has advisors of the president go because he's in difficulty because of an affair he had, right? Remind you of anything? So we need a foreign distraction to get this off the news cycle and get it replaced with something else. And so they create CGI, hire actors, set it in allegedly Albania or somewhere in ex-Yugoslavia. And the situation is there's a staged, choreographed, filmed, not real, fake blood atrocity that takes place. And it's called Wag the Dog because you're basically
Yeah. Manipulating public
projecting,
opinion.
like on Plato's cave, you know, stuff over here to distract you from this thing over here.
Yeah, it's weird times we live in, definitely. I mean, having lived through the whole period of 9/11, the internet basically, and 9/11, and, you know, all of the information on the internet and how people start to get their information from the internet, and people able to express their opinions and, you know, create websites and all that kind of stuff. Having lived through all that, and at least from, you know, a lot of the area that we were focused on, because the rest of the area is what, it's social media and showing pictures of your lunch and watching the mainstream news. The only real value for me anyway of the internet is alternative voices, the ability that it gives to other people who would never who never before got any airtime, to have some airtime. So obviously we focus on that because, well, I can look at CNN whenever I want. I can turn on the TV and watch CNN, but the internet is somewhere where you can find other ideas, other voices, you know. And those other voices that we've been looking at, a lot of them have been, you know, questioning the official narrative about things, you know. And a big part of that was obviously 9/11 and everything else that, you know, associated with the war on terror and the role of the US in the world, and then now Russia and all that kind of stuff. So it's really weird to have gone through that whole period, and it having been dominated to one extent or another by things that the official legacy media calls conspiracy theories.
Right.
And now, after 20 years plus, to see someone, the spokesman, Pentagon spokesman, validate one of the core kind of tenets of the fringe theories on the internet, you know, it's bizarre. It's kind of bizarre world, you know. Yeah. So I don't know. We don't know what's going to happen basically in terms of Russia, Ukraine. I'm pretty sure they're just going to keep it going. Something could come out of left field, but I don't think there's going to be any invasion. I mean, it's bizarre. They keep saying, yeah, we don't think there's going to be an invasion. You know, the media keeps putting that out there alongside articles that say Russia is poised to invade Ukraine. They have another article below it saying it doesn't look like Russia's going to invade Ukraine.
Yeah.
Because, you know, it's just not happening. It looks like they're doing it for another reason, basically.
I saw one today, 70% chance. It went from 110% certain last week.
They're saying
We're down to
probabilities
70% now. I think one of the factors is something we saw last week, the pushback from Ukraine. Their government pleaded several times in several different ways for Western media to tone down the rhetoric. You know,
Yeah.
I think the key part would be Ukraine being on board,
Yeah.
because and the massive price they would pay would be a civil war. Never mind whether or not Russia intervenes; they'd be looking at a civil war situation there.
Yeah, there's so many reasons why it shouldn't. It likely won't happen on all sides. That there's no investment. There's too much at stake. Too much to lose for everybody. Russia certainly doesn't want to engage in militarily in Ukraine or with Europe or with America or anything like that. But it's putting on a show of force in order to get some respect, basically, to get some attention, to make them come to the table and take their concerns seriously, which are very legitimate concerns, as I've just described. They're concerns that go back 20 years, that they've repeatedly made, and that are backed up by treaties and agreements that the US has given, if only verbally, and now they're breaking them. And Russia's like, listen, don't do this, stop it, this is bad, you have nothing to gain from this apart from some weird idea that you want to just contain us and stop us from taking our rightful place in the international order. But
That might be everything to some Washingtonians.
it might be, but it's still not legitimate. They can't voice it
yeah.
because it's illegitimate. It's not reasonable. It's not acceptable. No one anywhere in the world would accept that as a reasonable justification or a good reason for what they're doing. So they try and distort it, obviously, and claim that Russia's the aggressor and all that kind of stuff. But I think Russia's just, all of this military build-up and stuff is just a way to show their fangs in a certain sense, because that's all they can do at this point. They've nothing. They've tried everything else, and they realize it hasn't worked. They're not listening to us unless we, it's almost like a bully. The only thing a bully recognizes, and that's probably the main philosophy behind what they're doing right now, is that the only thing you can do with a bully is to stand up to him, basically. And the military build-up and that's been going on for the past several weeks is basically that, standing up to the bully and hoping that that's enough to make them see a bit of sense. Not that they're going to see sense, but you force them to stop doing what they're doing. At least stop the worst of it. And I think there might be enough. It might be enough to actually to achieve that end, but the whole thing just strikes me as a kind of like a distraction in a certain sense, a prelude to something else. As we've talked in previous shows about economic concerns and all that kind of stuff, but there's nothing serious in that front right now, but it's building. If you watch the news and different reports week on week, that's not going away, Inflation, threats of inflation, food prices, supply chain issues still murmuring away in the background, oil continuing its inexorable rise, energy insecurity, and Russia's part of that, obviously, particularly for Europe, but even globally. Russia is a major supplier of energy to the world. If there was some kind of a major problem or something where Russia would have to respond to sanctions, or Russia's energy production or supply was sanctioned, or Russia took some action itself in that respect, it could really destabilize the whole global, at least energy market, which then obviously has knock-on effects to everything else. So that's like lurking in the background, almost like as the real deal, as opposed to this
And
war fever or war fear type of stuff going on,
And the probability, I think you would agree that we should give to that is 100%. It may not be imminent, but
Yeah.
there's everything is pointing towards, and I wouldn't surprise
An
me
economic
if-
reset, a great reset, Neil. Everything's pointing. Well, certainly Klaus Daniel Schwab is pointing to a great reset. It has been. He wrote a book on it.
I think they're mad enough that they would see a severe global economic shock, maybe from the interruption in oil and gas supplies you mentioned, as a good thing, as an opportunity to
Reset.
and as they're mad enough, those that believe, to quote unquote green the economy, to
Well, certainly Russia's or America's, poking and chastising and provoking of Russia suggests desperation, because it's not achieving it. It seems that it's been checkmated by Russia, and particularly with Russia and China. And in response to this, Russia and China are cementing new deals, new energy deals. They're tying themselves together closer and closer. But which is weird, because that's the one thing that the Americans fear. But in taking this action, they're
cementing
creating the situation that they supposedly fear. And if, like we're saying, the Americans, the deep staters, if they get to the point where they feel they've got nothing left to lose, they certainly would precipitate or try to precipitate some kind of a crisis, an economic crisis, because that would be that's their Samson option in order to remain relevant or to maintain their hegemony, to maintain what they think. I mean, but certainly you're in the realm of crazy people really here, because it's not just a last-ditch effort like creating some kind of precipitating an economic crisis would defeat Russia and China or put them back in their place. It would destroy the whole thing. But they certainly think that in the US and in the West, they think they'll survive it and maybe they'll come out on top. They have some vague plan that would work. But a more objective analysis of it is that nobody wins in that situation. You know what I mean? It precipitates all sorts of bad things, and you can't predict that you're going to be the one who's going to come out unscathed or relatively unscathed from that, you know?
Yeah.
So, you have to, at a certain point, you have to accept that you likely are, as Russia already has done, we think, you have to accept that in the West, in the halls of power in the West, you're dealing with people who have lost their grip on reality. A scary thought, but...
Or if you want to give some credence to their old view of reality being reasonably objective in its time, then their grip on reality, they won't let go of as reality itself changes.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? George Kennan's time produced a lot of the people who are probably pulling the strings from the shadows in Washington, D.C. today, and they just will not let go of democracy is the best. It's the only way. American business is the only way. We will not have Russia and China. But everything they do produces Russia and China actually getting closer.
Well, that's an example of kind of a madness, you know, where, because there's that idea if the idea of continuing to do the same thing and thinking you'll get different results is a sign of madness or insanity. But they're even worse than that. They're continuing to do the same thing, and they're not. They're getting worse results. You know what I mean? They're not getting the same results. They're getting worse results. You know, they're shooting themselves in the foot. They're achieving the opposite of what they ostensibly claim to want to achieve.
Yeah,
and yet they continue. You know, it's like hit it with a shovel. It didn't work. Hit it again with a shovel. You know, it didn't work. Hit it again.
It has its own shovel now. Well, just swing your shovel at it and hope you knock its shovel out.
Yeah. That's a chunk of iron, sir. I don't think hitting it with a shovel is going to work. Hit it with a shovel.
About Russia, China.
Oh, we broke our shovel.
The Winter Olympics just kicked off. Before that, guest number one at the Olympics for Xi Jinping, who apparently hasn't left China in 2 years. Ever since Wuhan, that guy said, you know what, I'm staying right here. He hasn't left the country in 2 years.
Oh, hunker down, yeah.
He's like, we'll just rule from here. Something like that. Anyway, Putin goes to him, which he has done every year. They issue a united statement. I've never seen a Chinese statement so, not on this topic, so forthright. You know, they're usually quite, you know, peace, win-win cooperation. China said explicitly it supports Russia's demands that the US cease NATO expansion. I mean, that's not their sphere. It's not supposed to be. China would never touch it. But now they're like, okay, global peace. We have global outlook. And they call on the US to provide long-term security guarantees in Europe.
Yeah.
Russia. I can imagine in Washington, it's going to be like, you don't have a say about Europe.
Yeah, but NATO, yeah.
Never mind the South China Sea. Stay home, China man. But no, it's a new world now.
Well,
and China will say what it thinks about anywhere in the world.
And in response...
One last thing, they explicitly said in their joint statement, China and Russia will cooperate in thwarting color revolutions and external interference in other countries' affairs.
Right. And Russia also in response, kind of tit for tat, or you scratch my back, said that it supported China's stance on Taiwan, that Taiwan should not make any moves towards independence. So it was very much a mutual support.
Yeah, I think they're linked.
There,
I think if the US made a move in one, it would have to do it in both.
Yeah,
they're basically at the point now where, or rather, imagine if it didn't, and it's totally focused on Ukraine right now, and it's tried to stage something, and there was a conflict. Blah, blah. I think the Chinese will give them something to think about simultaneously by doing something vis-a-vis Taiwan.
Yeah, the
And
US,
they're probably aware of this, though. They probably have this.
the US have put themselves in a very bad position, like
Yeah.
you know, and on many different fronts. And if they continue, they're gonna reap the whirlwind, you know. And I think they will continue, unfortunately. But so, you've nothing to say about COVID then? Is COVID all gone?
We managed to get through a whole show without mentioning that C word.
Ah, the C word. As
Um,
long as you don't mention the N word. See Joe Rogan and the N word.
yeah.
Like he said in that he did a bit of a kind of I hate that term that he used in his second most recent thing.
A teaching moment.
No, teachable moment.
A teachable moment.
I first heard that. It was the only time I heard it directly from someone, and it was I don't know what it was about. It was actually about racism or something like that. Some guy on Facebook, some New York liberal dude, a teacher who was super, you know, immersed in the woke lefty ideology,
anti-Trump.
and he just anti-Trump, yeah,
Yeah.
and the whole racism thing, and he was accusing me of being racist because I wasn't saying bad things about Trump, and he was there was no talking to him, like he was unstoppable, you know, in his belief in his own rightness and ideology, and he kept on using that term, a teachable moment. You know, he had this arrogant thing where he was like, "This is a very good teachable moment for me to instruct you on the error of your ways." You know what I mean? So like no question, no doubt as to whether or not his perspective was right. So when I heard Rogan using that term, teachable moment, like, and it's like, oh God, dude, that is a phrase from that radical lefty woke
Right.
ideology. It's arrogant. It doesn't recognize anything other than their perspective, and it's because it implicit in it is I'm here to teach you.
Yeah.
It's kind of like similar to the idea that the whole where white people would have to have a black person or person of color to go around with them, to observe them, to let them know when they were displaying unconscious racism.
That's really a thing.
Yeah, because you can't see it yourself, right?
Right.
You can think, well, yeah, maybe you can look up different things and say, yeah, maybe if you want to, you know, do a mea culpa or whatever and prostrate yourself, you'd be able to identify some things maybe if you were to go there, but that's not enough. There's loads of things that you're not even aware of. Unconscious racism all
Right,
the time.
yeah.
It's in everything you do as a white person. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? The way you drink your tea, you know what I mean? And a black person or a person of color there would be able to teach you in that moment the error of your ways, you know?
Well,
So-
ironically, it's actually the ideological nonsense that has unconsciously seeped into, like Joe Rogan is spouting it there, you know.
Yeah.
The culture war is lost, so to speak, as plenty of commentators have pointed out, like genuine conservative ones. The conservatives, like, there's even a meme about it, you know. Conservatives are like, how does it go? They're 10 years too late or something, or they're arguing to save. How does it go? In 10 years' time, what they're hoping to, you know, keep at bay now, they'll have already moved on. The agenda will have progressed, and they'll look, you know, 10 years hence, the thing that they're pleading for will already be.
Yeah. A reality.
Yeah. So it's Rogan, but see, Rogan comes from a liberal. He voted
Exactly, yeah.
Bernie
Yeah,
twice.
yes, for sure, yep.
He is a liberal. This
Yep.
is how nuts it's all gotten.
Yep.
That this man is now the evil
Yeah.
Trump.
And
He
open-
has replaced Trump. Everything he utters, or even what he doesn't utter, what he said in the past, is a headline on CNN today. Because without Trump, they have to have someone to.
Yeah, yeah.
And he's actually one of them, so to speak. You know, that's
Yeah.
how much the culture war has just eaten its own
hmm
in the United States.
Yeah, it's going further and further to the extreme. You have to be an extremist basically to be accepted at all. If you're
Yeah.
outside of that far end of the spectrum, then you're up for. Yeah, and he, there's the teachable moment, and
Which we should explain if anyone didn't see it. He basically
there's a video that somebody
self-recorded
dug
a
up.
5-minute apology.
Well, what was interesting was that it came from, we mentioned the C word, the code word. He had basically a couple of doctors, virologist Robert Malone and Dr. McCullough, who basically, those two in particular, on his show over the past couple of months, who just questioned had a different perspective on the whole COVID narrative, right? And across the board in terms of all the aspects of it, including vaccines. And then a campaign was launched by someone somewhere, who knows where it came from, to get him to, well, those two shows were taken off Spotify and weren't allowed on YouTube, and then they went back. So there was a campaign to basically to cancel him.
Yeah, but
cancel-
a letter by 250 doctors.
Against that, who weren't actually
Yeah.
doctors anyway,
Yeah.
but who cares? But then, so there was an attack on Joe Rogan basically for speaking truth to power, basically, or countering the official narrative on COVID in particular. And because he did that, very quickly he found himself having to defend accusations of racism.
Yeah.
Totally disconnected from what he was initially attacked for, which was having a different perspective or allowing other people, facilitating other people to express a different opinion on COVID and vaccines.
Yeah, 2 years into it.
Right.
Because at the beginning, he was interviewing very different people.
Right. But so he does that. He simply facilitates other people to express counter narratives or different opinions to the official narrative on vaccines and COVID policies. And within a couple of weeks, he's having to defend himself and apologize for racism.
Yeah.
How do you get there?
Yeah.
How does that happen? Surely he should only address the issue that he was accused of,
Yeah.
which was spreading disinformation on Spotify or on the platform. But suddenly he has to defend against racism.
Yeah. This is what the real meaning of the culture war is. It's not really two sides. It's one. It's top down. It's culture war in the sense that the cultural war of the Maoists for a brief period during early communist China was. It's a government top down war against expressions of culture which threaten or have the potential to threaten our power. That's what it is. I mean, it's not a culture. It's not left versus right. It's Jen Psaki at the White House podium saying, yeah, I heard about Spotify removing all those. Yeah. Well, we think they could do more.
Yeah. And when a couple of days after she said that, doing more, at least in terms of this, putting Rogan in his place, was to force him to defend himself against accusations of being racist. A video put on you. There's a video
Right.
basically put out from years ago of a collection of any time he used the N word, that secret word that only black people, and to some extent, it's very, very interesting. I think people who are not African Americans, but who are still people of color, they can say the N word ending in A.
They can say all.
No, they can say it, but they can't.
Any version of it.
They can't.
No?
No, they can only say it with ending with A,
Right.
not ending with R.
Okay.
But African Americans can say the full word. It's interesting, Isn't it interesting that some people? I think Joe Rogan actually said it's interesting that some people can say a big section of the population can say a word,
Yeah.
and
the
others can't.
This is where this all began.
Because they can say it in loads of different ways. They can use it. It's just like it's a multi-purpose word. It's like you can say it as a term of endearment. You can say it as a put down. You can say it as a whatever.
That's the context Joe Rogan was using it on his podcast, making that point.
Yeah.
Ironically, and he didn't connect the two, he was speaking to the origins of prescribed speech. Where now I've got you, which ironically is
Then he
the
gets
acronym
prescribed.
is NIGI-SOB, which stands for, it's an acronym, which stands for Now I've Got You, You Son of a Bitch. There's no connection other than the parents' similar sounding thing there, but he was speaking to the origin of prescribed speech. That it was never, it's not officially prescribed. It's not illegal to say it, But functionally,
On social media.
you're screwed if you say it.
Or even in real life, yeah. That's weird. And no matter what context you use it in, that's the weird thing.
Yeah.
Because obviously there's contexts where it can be used as a slur or with negative connotations, and it will be very clear in the context that you use it, that's what you're using it in.
Yeah.
But you can't even say it. You can't even discuss it. You can't utter the word to discuss it from a sociological point of view. You couldn't even talk about it from an etymology point of view. You can't just use it to discuss the root of the word or the origin.
It's soon going to be verboten to use the term blacks.
Yeah.
That's already on the way out. It's either African Americans or people of color, or in the UK, it's BAME.
Black
People
African,
of black African and Middle Eastern, I think.
just black and Middle Eastern, I think.
Black and Middle Eastern, yeah. BAME, but
White-
black,
white-
no, that's
white-
a bit racist.
Bam, yeah.
We better get off this topic before I say what you're not allowed to say. I have
Go on.
kind of Tourette's syndrome where
Yeah, okay.
I tend to trip into saying it.
Yeah. And then that will be the end of the show on YouTube for sure.
On COVID, for what it's worth, it is worth something. I mean, it's worth something symbolically. You know, Rainer Fulmich, the German guy who started the Corona Investigative Committee, he did what Joe Rogan ought to have done, which is interview 500 plus people, experts, some of them, most of them actually, scientists or doctors, experts in some way involved with virology or the medical response to that, but also many political experts as well, legal experts and so on. 500 plus people over the last 2 years. Some of these things are like 4 hours long. There's multiple people. Some of them are like, they work in Geneva at the World Health Organization. They're part of all kinds of, anyway. And he's condensing all of that into a new website, which I'll put the link to in the show description, called covidcrime.org. What it is, and they issued opening statements to it yesterday, complete with a whole setup. There's Reiner and then his assistant, I've forgotten her name. She's also a lawyer. It's a grand jury proceeding based on the US model of opening a grand jury by the People's Court of Public Opinion to find those responsible and find a name and punish those responsible for the pandemic.
That'd be a hard job.
I know. But it's an impressive website. They basically bring they've got a whole team of people compiling stuff based on those interviews.
Did you just send it, Scotty?
Maybe we should put it up here, yeah. He's determined. I mean, we know it won't go anywhere, but
COVID crime, grand jury, court of public opinion, February 5th, 2020. That's it, just today. Okay. The largest organized crime against humanity ever perpetrated. Well, if that's true, then definitely head should roll. And COVID, and there's been just a bit of kind of COVID news again, mainstream kind of sources. Just go to the Telegraph, Scotty. Well, either one of them will do. Do one and then the other. Shambolic COVID PCR testing rules meant 1 in 3 who isolated were never contagious. Many forced to quarantine did not need to because threshold for positive tests was set very low, says study. University of Oxford academics found this.
oh, did they now?
Finally, after about 2 years. Pretty sure we were saying this
In April 2020?
probably end of March, even, within a couple of weeks. We're like, yeah, and then we said it, and many other people said it repeatedly over and over and over again to absolute stonewalling and silence. And now that it's all done and they've got everybody vaccinated, only now can you can the media recognize what so many people were saying for so long, which was that they were basically falsifying positive test results by setting the cycle count on the PCR tests way too high. Something that Fauci himself is on record as having said, on a video as having said before this all started, when he was talking about PCR tests, he said that, if you go above 35 or 36 cycle counts, you'll pretty much find you'll find anything. whatever you want, whatever you want to find, you will find. But what you'll find is dead remnants of the thing that you're looking for, like dead, like, you know, little pieces of that are of no significance.
Yeah.
I.e., so many people who have been getting positive PCR test results over the past 2 years have had nothing, no real evidence, or no real evidence of
The live
of the
SARS-CoV-2.
virus in them at
Yeah.
all. But they were positive and they had to isolate and take 10 days off work and blah blah blah. And the other one is just a little thing on vaccine passports. Interesting admission. A paper from the Environmental Modelling Group. It's the other Telegraph article. The paper from the Environmental Modelling Group says passes have limited impact on viral spread. And limited impact is the same thing as they also had there was I think we had it last week about lockdowns having limited impact on spread as well.
Yeah, that was Johns Hopkins.
John
itself,
Hopkins.
the source of the whole damn thing.
John Hopkins, limited impact from lockdowns. So lockdowns again. So PCR is bullshit, more or less, at least in the way that they were presented. Lockdowns, apparently, according to John Hopkins, very limited impact, didn't really help at all. But people were, you know, pretty seriously impacted, and, you know, a lot of people traumatized by the kind of lockdowns that were imposed on them, especially elderly people who were locked in their houses in fear of their lives. So that had very little impact either. And in this one, vaccine passports can be a lever, admitting that they can be a lever. And this is from the UK UK government Environmental Modelling Group. It says they have limited impact. So when you hear the word limited impact, it generally means it was useless. You know, that's just a kind of political speak or journalistic speak to say that really, if you look at it, there was no point in doing it. So no point in doing lockdowns. PCR tests were, in many cases, bogus. And vaccine passports also have limited impact. But vaccine passports, in the sense that it's not so much the vaccine passport, but it's the denial of people who don't have a vaccine passport, i.e. who aren't vaccinated, denying them access to social life. Has an impact on what? On getting people vaccinated. So all the people who already have the vaccine and, you know, it's not really having the vaccine doesn't help to stop the spread. And there's almost like there's an admission within this, and it's something else that's in the news as well, is that in terms of Omicron, the vaccines don't really work to stop the spread of Omicron, as we've seen many people over the past few months since Omicron has been around, who are fully vaccinated, coming down with Omicron. Now, is that from a dodgy PCR test? I don't know, because it's very complicated here when you throw all this together, you know what I mean? But at least officially, there's loads of people catching quote-unquote COVID, i.e. Omicron, while fully vaccinated. So, yeah, vaccine passports, vaccines don't... What are you trying to stop at this point is the question. You know what I mean? What's the danger? The whole thing is just so... it's hard to get your head around. It's just, you have to just dig right through it and figure out that this is just a means to some other end. That it's not really about health. If it ever was, it's not about health at this point.
Yeah. Did Austria actually implement that mandatory vaccination?
Apparently they did. Fines. I think it's starting on the
I think it started February 1st. That was when it was going to start.
But it wouldn't. Yeah, but it wouldn't. They wouldn't start implementing the actual fines until the middle of February or something. They've given some people
until
a grace period.
mid-March. Checks will begin in mid-March.
Okay.
But thereafter, anyone over 18 can be fined €3,600 up to 4 times a year, so about €14,000 per year. Per year. So they got it worked out for a year on year. I mean, that's what I don't understand. I'm in a kind of state of dissonance at the moment where I'm seeing headlines like Denmark lifts all restrictions. Oh, okay, yay, back to normal. Well, no, the caveat is if you're not vaccinated, you're not welcome.
Right. But
all restrictions are lifted except on all of you who are unvaccinated.
Right. But that's excluding unvaccinated people from the population. When you talk about the country and the people, it doesn't include the unvaccinated. Everything's fine in our country. Everything's free. Everything's open. If you're vaccinated.
That's
excluding vaccinated people.
That's the
from the
end
statement
goal.
about
Was that
how.
the end goal of all this? Then is what the end goal is.
Yeah, maybe.
This is what we're supposed to get to.
Look at the, just throw up the talking about Johns Hopkins JPEG. This is their data, and 95% of adults over 50 in Israel are vaccinated, and about 85% have received a booster. And there's the result on February 3rd. The little dot on the right-hand side.
Mm-hmm.
So,
They're
what do you
at the
conclude?
highest number of daily deaths from COVID.
Yeah. With almost everybody, pretty much everybody vaccinated over 50, and 85% with a third dose. Doesn't stop them getting Omicron, apparently. Although the saving grace is that Omicron is very similar to the cold for the vast majority of people. But still, it's talked about. It's, talked about in terms of it still being a pandemic. It's talked about in terms of people needing boosters, still get vaccinated. Again, I mean, the same people who are doing this, I think, are the same crazies that are doing the geopolitics.
You think so?
Well, it's certainly the same mindset. Not
Yeah.
the same people, but they have the same mindset. They all have lost their marbles in the same way, because they're detached. The extent of their detachment from reality and being able to just look at what's actually happening and take a rational response based on what's actually happening is gone. They are on some other track, on some other agenda.
Yeah.
Something else is
The
going on.
UN is putting out kind of info ads where I've got one here. The COVID pandemic is in its 6th year.
Right?
Do you want to see some of this thing? It's
Yeah.
nuts. This is kind of like the World Economic Forum's ads, by 2030 you will own nothing and you will be happy.
Yeah.
You know?
By 2020, we'll all be underwater. Because of
This is from
global warming.
UNICEF, exactly. So that's the Children's Agency of the United Nations.
The COVID pandemic is in its 6th year, and everybody's happy.
In 2020, scientists developed life-saving COVID-19 vaccines in record-breaking time. It was miraculous. It saved the lives of my parents and grandparents. In just a few months, nearly everybody in my country got the vaccine.
I lost my mother right at the start of the pandemic. So many doctors and nurses got sick. School closed down. But then came the vaccine.
You said life would return to normal. You restored our hope.
And you promised you wouldn't stop there. You said you'd help other countries. You promised to share vaccines with the whole world.
To make sure it ended everywhere, for everyone.
But you took too long.
You brought up supplies and held them back.
Just in case.
You let people in other countries suffer. Doctors and nurses kept getting sick.
Teachers died. You let the virus carry on, going round and round and round. It changed into even more dangerous variants.
Then it all came back. Again, and again, and again. Schools closed. Again.
Life kept getting turned upside down. For all of us. Things could have worked out so differently.
You knew that no one is safe.
Until everyone's safe.
Where's the barf bucket? It's okay in Africa. Because everybody there is taking hydroxychloroquine.
That is creepy. That's like Greta on steroids.
I'll give you nightmares.
No one is safe until everybody is safe. Yeah, no one died from coronavirus in Africa. Well, better be careful with that statement. Extremely few numbers, like unbelievably small numbers compared to the West.
Mm-hmm. Yep, because of
But anyway,
hydroxychloroquine.
the main point here
ivermectin.
isn't, I'm not even going to start from the numbers because that gets us in trouble every time. It's the fact that this is coming from the top down. For them, COVID didn't end. It's
No.
forever.
It's not over. The band's going to make it.
It's forever and ever and ever and ever.
Yeah. So it suggests there's an agenda. And of course, you know, they'll just segue into that agenda and with another reason, another crisis, another this. And people won't have time to stop and think, you know. I mean, certainly if you're not paying attention on the ball, then you're going to miss it. You're going to just go along and into a new normal. And, you know, it's important to chart these things and to look at them and to, you know, to study them and analyze the whole situation. And you have to have a certain perspective in order to do that. You know, you can't just be stuck with your head in the sand and dependent entirely on the media and government for your every word. I mean, people have plenty of reason today to distrust government and the media, right? At least to question it and to engage in their own analysis of the situation. But maybe a lot of people can't do that, even to a minimal degree. So they're stuck. They're in a tough spot, you know. It's just a word on the vaccines. I mean, there's stuff coming out. Well, maybe we'll do more about it on another show next week or something. But we've said this before anyway, that there has been stuff come out over the past week showing, or past few weeks, a study showing that natural protection, i.e. naturally acquired immunity to COVID, to the coronavirus, this SARS-CoV-2, is as good, possibly better, longer lasting than immunity derived from the mRNA vaccines in particular. And also there's a possibility, I'm not going to say this is a case, it still has to be looked into, and obviously the whole vaccine thing is new and mRNA vaccines are new, but that mRNA vaccines might actually, in terms of the kind of immunity that they provoke in your body, I've said this before, that it's too specific, it's too focused too tightly on one particular part of one particular variant of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and maybe training your immune system in a way that's less than optimal, where it would not have an optimal response, natural response, based because of the kind of memory cells and that it provokes towards a particular part of this virus. There's an idea called original antigenic sin. Do I have it somewhere here? Original antigenic sin refers to the propensity of the body's immune system to preferentially utilize immunological memory based on previous infection when a second, slightly different version of that foreign pathogen or virus is encountered. So basically, you train your system to develop an immune response through vaccines, in this case, to develop memory cells for that specific type of virus, a specific part of that specific type of virus, which means that then use that same memory in a wrong way, basically, for future infections. You know, to basically, it mounts a less than optimal immune response. It focuses too narrowly and too tightly on one particular virus, one particular part of a virus, meaning that whenever a new variant of that comes along, or a recombined, say with another virus, comes along that has a part of that, it'll focus your immune system in a too narrow way again on that, leaving you with a less than optimal immune response compared to a natural immune response, which tends to be broader and more, you know, a more general immune response, you know, a newer immune response, you know. It's like traumatizing you.
More versatile.
Yeah, it's kind of like training you to respond unthinkingly or reactively to something because it was kind of like a traumatic experience.
It's a very precise trigger of that experience.
Yeah. So you'll respond ineffectively to
a broader array of triggers that are similar-ish.
Right.
Yeah.
There's stuff. I mean, that's just a very general explanation of it, but there's that's a big question mark right now. You know, and again, it's not known because there's a very new situation, and they don't know a lot about exactly what effect these mRNA vaccines, and in particular repeated boosts of them, are having on people's immune system. We said it on a previous show where I think it was the European
Medicines Agency
said that repeated boosters with mRNA vaccines could have actually detrimental effects on your immune system. So it's not a good idea to keep boosting people. Now that says that's a negative comment on mRNA vaccines. Okay, in the context of repeated boosters, but the question then is, well, what if you had effectively 3 doses of that mRNA vaccine? Is it okay? It's just the 4th one or the 5th one would be bad? Or do they in some way compromise your immune system already when you've had the mRNA vaccines? Who knows? We'll find out. We're just leaving it open. We're not making any statements. It's not medical misinformation. We're just opening it up. You know, science is all about questioning, right?
I tell you what, this whole vaccine thing has trained your ability to say things as patiently and diplomatically and as scientifically as you possibly can without...
I'm afraid of YouTube, you know. I have nightmares about YouTube. No, I don't really. But anyway, that was all very... I think we need to end on
space news.
A positive note.
Oh, okay.
Do you have space news?
Yeah, it's awesome. Everyone missed it because of the way we think of it. Like, reporters on asteroids just do not understand what's going on. Every time a new thing is observed in space, they're like, oh, isn't that awesome? It must be because we're watching more of it. No. The cutbacks in space observation, like their budgets have plummeted, whether they're private agencies or official ones like NASA. So when new objects are observed, like, it says a lot. There's probably a lot more of them. So Earth picked up its second Trojan asteroid in 1 decade. For 11 years, to be precise. It picked up one in 2011, and now...
What's a Trojan asteroid?
A Trojan asteroid is an asteroid that is ordinarily in our environment and it flies past it, but it's close enough that Earth's gravity picks it up and pulls it into orbit. It's now orbiting us.
Oh, cool.
We did just used to have the moon. Now we have 2 asteroids.
Oh, cool.
For sure, that we know of, that are going around in orbit.
Are they in a stable orbit, or could they...
Stable orbit. They have to be stable in order to be classified Trojan.
Okay.
So we got 2 new moons in the last 11 years, and that should be, you know, headline news. Instead, it's sort of like, oh, yeah, that's awesome. That must be because of our awesome technologies that can see all these things.
Yeah.
It's like humans are so like, let's just pat each other on the back, you know, aren't we awesome?
Yeah.
Not really. This is not a good sign.
Can we mine them?
That's the second thing they asked.
Yeah.
No, the second thing they ask is, awesome, we can study this thing because it'll tell us about the origins of the solar system.
Right.
It's included in every story about asteroids. I don't know why, but it's the first thing to think of. This will increase our knowledge of ourselves and where we came from.
Yeah.
Okay. The third question is, can we make money out of it?
Yeah. Maybe they need an up-close encounter with one, just to really study it closely, you know?
Yeah, on fire through the atmosphere.
When it lands in your city, then you can give it a good studying. Okay, yeah.
So that's my positive news.
Well, I have more
today.
positive news.
Yeah.
I have even better positive news than that. And it's that Nancy Pelosi, this is slightly old news, it's maybe 10 days or so old.
She's not
but
still alive.
She's running again. You know, obviously the midterms are coming, and she's only 700 years old, so there's plenty of life in the old bird yet. So
vaccines definitely work in some cases.
Yeah, for sure. Extend your life. They save you from death, basically. Nancy's a living testimony to it. She's probably had 14 of them or something. But yeah, if you just tear up there, Scotty. Nancy is. This is just
she's looking well for 700.
Exactly. Well, she's been. There's probably a lot of editing there done on that video, but there's just a short section of it, and it just but it's the main part. It'll restore your faith. Put it that way.
Good.
When people ask me what are the 3 most important issues facing the Congress, I always say the same thing: our children, our children, our children, their health, their education, the housing and economic security of their families, a clean, safe environment in which they can thrive, and a world of peace in where they are all welcome and in which they can reach their fulfillment. That is my why I am in Congress, for the children. This is my story, and this is my song. As you hear me say, when you're in the arena, you have to be able to take a punch or throw a punch for the children. For the children. For the children. For the children. For the children.
That's my
for the children.
Oh, kill me now. Kill me now. And people obviously vote for her, so
Yeah, well, she's
it
in it
works.
for the children, but her children are a bunch of the big companies that are on the stock exchange. They're the children she's talking about, actually. And they're the ones that she gets inside information, info on, and that her husband then buys or sells stock in. And it's for the children, Neil.
It's for the
It's
children.
for my children.
I think I saw a memed version of that where they start where they're talking and the buildings in the background start going on fire. And there's a riot, you know.
Oh, yeah. For the children. I'm saving the children. Yeah, that's where peak hypocrisy, peak bullshit,
Yeah.
peak manipulation. And if you
Well,
can't
you
see
say
through
that
it,
now, but
well,
this time
yeah,
next year.
maybe. I don't think it can get any worse.
That's what they all say.
Nah, it can't get any worse.
People watching this, comment there, you got to hold Joe to that.
Yeah,
On this day, February 6th, 2022, Joe said it can't get any worse.
yeah. The hypocrisy.
The hypocrisy can't get any worse.
Yeah, the other things can get worse for sure, but the peak bullshit, like, you can't go any further than they've gone, like, you know. And if you don't get it, you don't get it because you haven't looked into it, you haven't thought for yourself, you haven't researched it, so you don't get it and you won't get it. But at this point, for people who actually know what's going on and have an idea of what's going on and know a bit of the history and know the background to what these people are talking about, it's peak hypocrisy. Like, it's, like I keep saying, it's 180. Like, I mean, it has been that way for a while, but it's just the amount of 180s that are coming out in terms of what they say and the truth being exactly the opposite is crazy, you know. Because
They're coming
there's only so
fast
far
and
you can go
furious.
before you would start waking up the people who are basically asleep who don't pay any attention to it. If you go too far and you start saying egregiously false things, you risk you risk your job, you risk red pilling people, as they say, you know. So I think it'll continue on in this way, and we'll continue to be harassed and annoyed by it, and have steam coming out of our ears and that kind of thing. But it can't get any worse. But I may be wrong. I'm open to being wrong. It'll be amazing. It'll be awesome if they go even further than the shit they come out with already. But yeah.
I think there's more to come, because that thing from the we saw from Price and Kirby with we've got declassified information. The Russians are planning to do, crisis actors, fake blood. That for me is the opening.
That's peak.
It's because once you open that realm, it's like infinite iteration. We saw that with conspiracy lore over the last 2 decades. And clearly there were some people who started, and then others poured fuel on the fire because it became the dominant alternative account to the official explanation of all these atrocities. It saturated all of it. So I think that might be like the hole in the dike that's going to
Open the gates of hell.
yeah, a full-on Alex Jones and worse. In fairness, we shouldn't cite him. I'm talking full-on, like full mental conspiracy theory stuff from Washington on a daily basis.
That would be awesome.
That could be coming.
To
The point where European governments are like, okay,
White House Gov would become like a conspiracy website.
yeah.
Yeah. Just go to White House Gov, you'll find all the good conspiracies there. All the good conspiracy theories. Yeah. Okay. I've been going for quite a while here, over 2.5 hours. But yeah, we hope you enjoyed it, guys. Thanks for watching, listening, commenting. That's a hold my beer moment for Pelosi. Yeah, exactly. We hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, listening, for subscribing. If you haven't done so, please subscribe. We'll be back next week with another show. Until then, have a good week and stay safe, and shut up and get the vaccine.
See you next week, everyone. Bye.
Can't stop the signal now.